It crept over France like a held breath, heavy and unnatural, as if the land itself sensed what was about to happen. Church bells had already fallen silent. Streets emptied earlier than usual. In monasteries and commanderies across the kingdom, men who had spent their lives in prayer and discipline felt an unease they could not name. Some later claimed they woke moments before the knock came, hearts racing, hands trembling. Not from guilt, but from confusion. Just before dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, torches ignited the darkness. Royal soldiers moved with terrifying coordination. Orders sealed with the king's wax were opened simultaneously across France. No warnings, no trials, no mercy. The Knights Templar, the most powerful military religious order in Christendom, were declared enemies of God in a single night. Doors were smashed open. Brothers were dragged from their beds still wearing prayer robes. Chains replaced rosaries. Horses screamed in courtyards as steel rang against stone. Men who had sworn lifelong obedience to the church now heard the words heresy and blasphemy spoken against them by the same institution they had defended with blood. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars had been untouchable. They were not ordinary monks. They were warriors sanctified by faith, men who had faced death in the deserts of the Holy Land and survived. They answered directly to the Pope, beyond the reach of kings. Their banners had flown over crusader armies. Their treasuries held the wealth of Europe. Their reputation was built on discipline, sacrifice, and absolute loyalty to Christ. And yet, in a single night, they became fugitives in the eyes of God. The accusations were shocking, so shocking they spread faster than reason. The Templars were said to deny Christ, to spit on the cross, to worship a mysterious idol with many faces, to perform obscene rituals in secret chambers, to harbor knowledge so corrupt that even hearing it could damn a soul. To the public, the story was simple. The order had fallen into darkness. But simplicity is often a mask. As the arrests continued, something strange became clear. The soldiers were not searching for weapons. They were not seizing land at random. They were looking for documents, for records, for objects unnamed in the warrants. In several commanderies, chests had already been emptied, as if the Templars had expected this night long before it arrived. Some brothers did not resist. They knelt, they prayed. Others stared in silence, eyes steady, as if this was not a defeat but an inevitability. A few whispered final instructions to novices before being dragged away, words that would never be recorded. By sunrise, thousands were imprisoned. In the days that followed, the interrogations began. Under torture, men confessed to impossible crimes, not because they were true, but because pain makes truth irrelevant. Yet within these confessions, historians later noticed something unsettling. The interrogators kept circling the same questions. Again and again, they pressed for details about secret ceremonies, hidden teachings, and a knowledge shared only among the inner circle. It was as if the authorities already believed something, and were desperate to force it into the open. King Philip IV of France publicly framed the arrests as an act of righteous justice. He spoke of protecting the faith, of cleansing corruption from the church. But privately, he was a man cornered by debt, by political weakness, and by fear. The Templars were not just wealthy. They were independent. They answered to Rome, not Paris. And worse, they knew things. The Pope, Clement V, hesitated. That hesitation is one of the most important silences in history. When word reached him, Clement did not immediately endorse the arrests. He demanded evidence. He delayed. He questioned. Letters survive that reveal a man deeply uneasy, not only about the accusations, but about the consequences of investigating them too deeply. For weeks, the fate of the order hung in limbo, and during that time something extraordinary happened. The narrative hardened. What began as charges of financial misconduct transformed into claims of spiritual corruption. The focus shifted from money to belief, from power to doctrine. The Templars were no longer just inconvenient, they were dangerous. And danger requires erasure. Across Europe, reactions were mixed. In England and parts of Germany, rulers expressed doubt. In Spain and Portugal, the arrests were delayed or softened. Some bishops refused to believe the accusations at all. They had lived beside these men, prayed with them, watched them die for the cross. Could an entire order have secretly betrayed Christ for generations without anyone noticing? The question lingered and still does. As trials dragged on, many Templars recanted their confessions when torture ceased. They insisted they were innocent. They spoke of loyalty, of faith, of obedience. But by then, it no longer mattered. The story had taken on a life of its own. Once heresy is declared, innocence becomes irrelevant. The machinery of destruction had been set in motion. In 1314, 7 years after that first night of terror, the final act unfolded on an island in the Seine. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood bound to a stake. He was old, worn, but witnesses say his voice was steady. He did not confess. Instead, he proclaimed the order's innocence and called upon God to judge those who had condemned them unjustly. Flames rose. Smoke swallowed his final words. And with his death, the Knights Templar officially vanished from history. Or so we are told. Because institutions that destroy so completely rarely do so out of mere greed. Armies are raised for gold. Orders are erased for ideas. And the deeper historians dig into the fall of the Templars, the more unsettling the pattern becomes. The Church did not simply dismantle a military order. It buried documents, sealed testimonies, locked away archives for centuries. When fragments resurfaced, they hinted not at devil worship, but at belief systems that challenged the very foundation of medieval Christianity. What if the Templars did not lose their faith, but found something older? What if beneath Jerusalem, beneath the Temple Mount itself, they uncovered a version of Christianity the Church had spent centuries suppressing? And what if that knowledge, not gold, not power, was the true reason the order had to disappear? That night in 1307 was not the end of the Knights Templar. It was the beginning of a silence so carefully maintained that even today, asking the wrong questions still makes institutions uncomfortable. Because once you accept that history can be rewritten by fear, you are forced to ask a far more dangerous question. If the Church buried the truth once, what else might still be buried with it? Long before the torches of 1307 cut through the French darkness, long before the word Templar inspired fear or reverence, the world that created these men was already soaked in blood, dust, and longing. Europe at the end of the 11th century was fractured and restless. Kingdoms rose and collapsed with alarming speed. Faith was absolute, but certainty was rare. For the average believer, salvation felt distant. Locked behind pilgrimages few could survive and sins few could fully confess. Jerusalem, the physical heart of Christendom, lay far beyond the horizon, controlled by forces that Western Europe barely understood and deeply feared. When Pope Urban II stood before the crowd at the Council of Clermont in 1095, his words ignited more than religious zeal. They awakened desperation. He spoke of sacred lands defiled, of Christians oppressed, of a holy duty that promised not just forgiveness of sins, but meaning. For thousands, the call to crusade was not about conquest. It was about escape, from poverty, from guilt, from a world that offered little hope of redemption. The First Crusade was not an army. It was a tide. Untrained peasants marched beside armored nobles. Faith replaced strategy. Hunger replaced discipline. And yet, against all expectation, Jerusalem fell in 1099. The victory was brutal, soaked in blood and fire, but to those who survived, it felt like divine confirmation. God had chosen them, but the miracle did not last. In the years that followed, the roads to the holy city became corridors of death. Pilgrims arriving to pray at Christ's tomb were robbed, enslaved, or slaughtered before reaching its gates. The kingdom of Jerusalem was fragile, surrounded by hostile powers, unable to protect the endless stream of believers drawn by faith and promise. It was in this broken landscape that a strange idea took form. Around 1119, a small group of knights arrived in Jerusalem, led by a French noble named Hugues de Payens. They were not conquerors. They did not seek land or titles. Instead, They approached the king of Jerusalem with an unusual offer. They would dedicate their lives to protecting pilgrims on the roads, asking nothing in return. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. The name was not symbolic. They owned almost nothing. Early descriptions paint a stark image. Two men sharing one horse, armor patched and worn, living under strict vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were warriors, yet they lived like monks, fighters who renounced personal glory. In a world defined by excess and ambition, this contradiction was revolutionary. For nearly a decade, they existed in near obscurity. No grand banners, no castles, no recognition from Rome. They operated quietly, escorting travelers, standing guard in places others avoided. Many pilgrims survived because of them, and many of these nameless knights died without record. Then came the moment that changed everything. The king of Jerusalem granted the group quarters on the Temple Mount, in a wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, believed by Christians to stand on the ruins of Solomon's Temple. The location was practical, but its symbolism was immense. These men were now living at the very heart of biblical history, above layers of faith, conquest, and myth. It was here that whispers began. Some chroniclers later claimed the knights spent long hours beneath the surface, digging, measuring, searching. Officially, they were expanding storage and stables. Unofficially, rumors spread of tunnels, chambers, and relics older than Christianity itself. There is no direct evidence of what they found, if anything at all. But the speed of what followed suggests something extraordinary occurred. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the obscure brotherhood was suddenly elevated. With the backing of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the age, the group was formally recognized as a religious order. Their mission was sanctified, their rules were written, their purpose declared holy. They became the Knights of the Temple. Bernard's support was not casual. His writings framed the Templars as a new kind of Christian, men who killed without sin because they killed in God's name. Violence, once a moral stain, was transformed into an act of devotion. For a medieval world struggling to reconcile faith with warfare, this was revolutionary theology. And Europe responded. Donations flooded in. Land, money, castles. Entire villages were handed over to the order. Sons of noble families pledged their lives. Kings sought their favor. Within a generation, the once poor knights became an international institution, stretching from the British Isles to the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet despite this sudden rise, the Templars remained unusually secretive. Their rule demanded silence. Their ceremonies were closed to outsiders. Their internal hierarchy was strict, and information flowed upward, rarely outward. Even sympathetic churchmen admitted they knew little of what happened behind Templar walls. This secrecy bred fascination and unease. Unlike other orders, the Templars did not simply fight wars. They administered land, managed resources, built roads, ports, and fortifications. They became logistical masterminds in a chaotic world. And slowly, almost accidentally, they began to solve a problem no one else could. Money. Traveling with gold was dangerous. Pilgrims were robbed. Merchants were murdered. The Templars introduced a system that allowed travelers to deposit funds in Europe and withdraw them in the Holy Land using coded documents. It was simple, brilliant, and transformative. They had invented banking. With this innovation came influence. Kings borrowed from them. The Church entrusted them with funds. Even enemies respected their neutrality. Templar fortresses were considered inviolate, protected not just by arms, but by reputation. And still, beneath it all, they lived under vows of poverty. This contradiction, immense wealth controlled by men forbidden from owning anything, made the order both powerful and unsettling. They were not driven by personal ambition. They did not seek crowns. Their loyalty was not to nations, but to something older and more abstract. Faith, or perhaps understanding. As the decades passed, legends grew. Some said the Templars possessed relics that granted divine favor. Others whispered they guarded texts that redefined Christ's message. Most dismissed these as rumors born from envy. But rumors do not arise in a vacuum. What is certain is this. From the moment the Templars rose, they did not behave like an ordinary military order. They moved carefully. They guarded knowledge as fiercely as territory. They cultivated loyalty not through fear, but through belonging. To become a Templar was not to join an army. It was to enter a world within the world. And in that world, belief was not always what it seemed. By the end of the 12th century, the Knights Templar had become indispensable to Christendom, and quietly dangerous to any institution that relied on unquestioned authority. Because once men learn that faith can coexist with inquiry, obedience becomes fragile. The seeds of their destruction were already planted. They just needed time to grow. To the outside world, becoming a Knight Templar looked simple. A man renounced his former life, knelt before an altar, and pledged himself to God. But what appeared public and solemn was only the surface of a far deeper transformation. Behind closed doors, away from witnesses and chroniclers, initiation into the order unfolded in shadows, silence, and deliberate mystery. The ceremony did not begin with glory. It began with stripping. A candidate was asked to surrender everything that defined him: wealth, titles, family ties, even his name as he had known it. He stood not as a noble or a warrior, but as something unfinished. The message was clear. Whatever he had been before did not belong beyond this threshold. Then came the questions. They were not gentle. He was asked if he joined freely, if he carried debts, if he owed loyalty to any king, lord, or bloodline above the order. Each answer mattered. A divided allegiance was considered more dangerous than an enemy blade. Only after these declarations was the candidate brought closer to the altar, not always the main chapel, but often a smaller, enclosed space. Candles were few. Silence was enforced. What was spoken here would not be repeated outside these walls. The vows followed: poverty, chastity, obedience. But unlike other monastic orders, these vows were framed not as escape from the world, but as preparation for it. The Templar was not withdrawing from violence. He was sanctifying it. His obedience was not abstract, it was absolute. Then came the oath itself. The exact words are lost, and perhaps deliberately so. But surviving trial records, written under coercion centuries later, suggest the oath contained promises not recorded in the official rule. Promises of secrecy, of silence even unto death, of loyalty to brothers above all else. It was here that suspicion later took root. During the trials of the early 14th century, many Templars were accused of swearing oaths that contradicted church doctrine. They were said to deny Christ in private while defending him in public, to mock the cross, to exchange kisses in strange places as symbols of submission, to revere knowledge over dogma. Most historians dismiss these claims as products of torture, and they are right to do so in part. But even false confessions can reveal real fears. The accusations shared a pattern. They did not focus on greed or rebellion. They fixated on belief, on ritual, on the possibility that the Templars practiced a Christianity different from the one taught at the pulpit. That possibility alone was enough to terrify the medieval church. The Templars were not ignorant peasants. Many were literate. Some were educated in theology, geometry, and ancient languages. They traveled between cultures, absorbing ideas from Islamic scholars, Jewish mystics, and Eastern Christians. Exposure like that changes people, especially those trained to observe and protect rather than conquer blindly. Within the order, hierarchy was rigid, but mentorship was personal. Younger knights learned not only how to fight, but how to think. They memorized scripture, yes, but they also learned discipline of the mind. Silence was enforced not to suppress thought, but to sharpen it. Words were considered dangerous. Knowledge, once spoken, could not be reclaimed. This mindset helps explain the strange restraint that defined the Templars. Unlike other orders, they produced very little theological writing. They did not preach publicly. They left no manifestos. If they held unorthodox views, they hid them well, not out of shame but out of caution. There are hints, however. Several medieval observers noted that Templars seemed indifferent to outward displays of piety. They prayed, but without spectacle. They attended Mass, but without emotional excess. Their faith appeared internal, measured, almost philosophical. In an age obsessed with miracles and relics, this restraint was unsettling. Some scholars believe the Templars practiced a form of inner devotion, a belief that the divine was not confined to institutions or objects, but accessible through discipline, silence, and understanding. This idea was not heretical by nature, but it clashed with a church that claimed exclusive authority over salvation. If God could be encountered without intermediaries, power shifted. The secrecy of the initiation rituals may have served a practical purpose as well. The Templars operated across borders, often in hostile territory. Loose words could get men killed. Codes, symbols, and unspoken rules created unity where language failed. But secrecy, once established, becomes its own identity. Symbols took on meaning beyond decoration. The red cross on white was not merely a badge. It marked a boundary between the known and the initiated. Even the order's architecture reflected this philosophy. Austere exteriors, carefully structured interiors, spaces designed to guide movement and attention. Nothing was accidental. Within these spaces, instruction continued long after initiation. Brothers advanced through ranks, gaining access to deeper responsibilities, and perhaps deeper knowledge. The higher one rose, the more silence was required. The inner circle remained invisible, even to many within the order. This structure fueled later speculation that the Templars possessed esoteric teachings passed only to the most trusted members. Teachings that may have originated not in Rome, but in Jerusalem, shaped by encounters with ancient traditions long excluded from Western Christianity. The Church had fought hard to define orthodoxy. Councils had been convened. Texts had been selected, others destroyed. Alternative interpretations of Christ's message had been labeled dangerous and erased. The Templars, intentionally or not, walked among the remnants of those erased traditions. Living above the Temple Mount meant living atop history itself. Layers of belief stacked like sediment. Jewish scripture, early Christian sections, Islamic scholarship. Each had claimed this ground as sacred. Each had left traces behind. It is not unreasonable to imagine that curiosity followed proximity. And curiosity, when paired with discipline, becomes inquiry. If the Templars did uncover ideas that challenged church authority, secrecy would not have been rebellion. It would have been survival. They could not openly oppose Rome, nor would they have wanted to. Their loyalty was sincere, but loyalty does not require blindness. The tragedy is that silence, meant to protect, became evidence against them. When the trials began centuries later, that silence was filled with accusations. The absence of explanation allowed imagination to flourish, guided by political necessity rather than truth. And so the initiation rites of the Templars, once a doorway into purpose and belonging, were recast as gateways to heresy. What had been sacred was labeled profane. What had been disciplined was called corrupt. Whether the Templars truly held forbidden beliefs may never be fully known. But one truth remains undeniable. They believed some things were too powerful to be spoken aloud. And in a world where power depends on controlling the story, that belief alone was enough to make them dangerous. The roads leading to Jerusalem were never truly silent. Even in the early hours of dawn, the wind carried the sound of footsteps, prayers murmured through dust-dry lips, the creak of wagons, the nervous whispers of families who had traveled for months with nothing but faith to guide them forward. For pilgrims, the journey itself was an act of devotion, each blister a penance, each danger a test of belief. And danger was everywhere. Bandits watched from rocky ridges. Local warlords demanded tolls that few could pay. In the narrow passes outside the holy city, entire caravans vanished without trace. The dream of reaching Christ's tomb often ended in shallow graves beneath the sun. It was along these roads that the Knights Templar first earned their reputation. They did not march in grand formations or announce their presence with banners. Small patrols moved quietly, appearing where they were least expected. Their armor was plain, their weapons practical. They asked no payment. They accepted no reward. They simply rode beside the vulnerable until the danger passed. For many pilgrims, the sight of the red cross on white was the difference between life and death. Yet even in these earliest years, their role was more complex than protection alone. The Templars did not merely escort, they observed. They learned the rhythms of the land, the habits of enemies, the shifting alliances of the Levant. Knowledge, for them, was a form of defense. Jerusalem itself was not a city at peace. Though claimed by Christians, it was surrounded by forces that considered it lost, not conquered. The political map of the region changed constantly. Treaties were signed and broken. Armies advanced and retreated like tides. In this environment, the Templars became something rare, a constant. They guarded roads, but also gates. They manned outposts no one else wanted. They stood watch at shrines exposed to attack, often with little reinforcement. Their discipline made them reliable in a land defined by uncertainty. And then there was the Temple Mount. Granted to them as quarters, it was officially a practical decision. Space within Jerusalem was limited. The former mosque provided shelter for horses, storage, and sleeping quarters. But no one involved could have ignored its symbolic weight. This was the ground where Solomon's temple had once stood, the heart of ancient Jewish worship, the legendary repository of divine presence. Beneath its stones lay centuries of destruction and rebuilding, each layer shaped by faith and conflict. Living there changed the order. The Templars began to identify themselves not just as defenders of pilgrims, but as guardians of something far older. Their very name tied them to the temple. Not the church, not a king, but a place where heaven and earth were believed to have once met. Contemporary accounts describe brothers spending long hours beneath the complex, moving between chambers, reinforcing foundations, clearing debris. Officially, these were maintenance efforts. Unofficially, curiosity followed every blow of the pickaxe. Stories spread among locals and pilgrims alike. Of strange stones unearthed, of sealed chambers discovered and quietly resealed, of artifacts removed under cover of night. No records confirm these tales, but their persistence suggests the Templars' activities were noticed. What they may have found is less important than what others believed they might have found. In a medieval world where relics could legitimize kingdoms and shape doctrine, the idea that a private order had access to the buried heart of sacred history was unsettling. Beyond Jerusalem, the Templars' network expanded rapidly. They established way stations along major routes, each serving as both refuge and intelligence post. Messages moved faster through Templar hands than through royal couriers. They knew which roads were safe before anyone else did. This efficiency was not accidental. The order operated under a strict code that punished recklessness as harshly as cowardice. A knight who charged without orders could be expelled. A brother who spoke carelessly could face severe penance. Every action served a purpose larger than the individual. To outsiders, this discipline looked cold. To those under their protection, it looked like certainty. Yet the deeper their involvement in the region, the more the Templars absorbed its complexity. They fought Muslim armies, but they also respected their skill. They negotiated truces. They observed customs. Some even learned Arabic, studying texts forbidden to most Europeans. This exposure broadened their understanding of faith. Islamic scholars preserved works of philosophy, mathematics, and medicine long forgotten in the West. Jewish traditions maintained layers of scripture interpretation far deeper than surface readings. Eastern Christian sects practiced beliefs Rome had declared heretical centuries earlier. The Templars stood at the crossroads of these traditions. And crossroads are dangerous places for rigid beliefs. None of this made the Templars less Christian, but it may have made them more aware that Christianity was not a single, unchanging truth. It had histories, interpretations, and omissions. The roads they guarded became arteries of exchange, not just of people but of ideas. As decades passed, the Templars' role evolved. They were no longer merely reacting to threats. They anticipated them. Their fortresses were placed with strategic precision. Their patrols operated according to patterns invisible to casual observers. They became a stabilizing force in an unstable land. And stability breeds influence. Local rulers sought their counsel. Merchants trusted them with goods. Pilgrims followed their guidance without question. Even rival military orders grudgingly acknowledged their effectiveness. Yet with influence came scrutiny. Some questioned why the Templars seemed more invested in certain locations than others, why they guarded obscure sites with unusual intensity, why certain ruins attracted their attention while grand shrines did not. These questions rarely reached official records, but they lingered in the margins of chronicles, in the muttered comments of travelers. The idea took hold that the Templars were not only protecting the road to Jerusalem, but protecting Jerusalem itself from something unseen, or protecting something hidden within it. By the mid-12th century, the order had become inseparable from the Holy Land's geography and mythology. Their identity was bound to the landscape, to the dust beneath their boots and the stone beneath their walls. This bond would later be used against them. When the Holy Land began to slip from Christian control, blame needed a target. When Jerusalem was lost, questions were asked about those who had sworn to defend it. When faith faltered, suspicion followed. The guardians of the road became convenient symbols of failure. But before that fall, before betrayal and fire, the Templars had already carved their legacy into the land, not through conquest, but through presence. They stood watch where others fled. They learned where others judged. They listened where others preached. And in doing so, they may have uncovered truths that made simple obedience impossible. The roads they guarded did not just lead pilgrims to Jerusalem. They led the Templars themselves toward a destiny shaped as much by what they discovered as by what they defended. Gold has a particular way of capturing the human imagination. It glitters, it weighs heavily in the hand, and it leaves clear traces behind. If the Knights Templar had uncovered chests of coins or jeweled crowns beneath Jerusalem, history would have recorded it loudly. Kings would have fought wars over it. Chronicles would have named it, counted it, fought over its ownership. But the rumors surrounding the Templars were never so simple. From the earliest years of the order, whispers followed them, not of sudden riches, but of something far more unsettling. Travelers spoke of discoveries that changed the brothers' behavior. Clerics hinted at dangerous curiosities. Even friendly observers admitted that the Templars seemed to possess a confidence that went beyond wealth or military strength. It was as if they had found something that made ordinary power seem trivial. The most persistent rumors placed this discovery beneath the Temple Mount. The site itself was a palimpsest of sacred history. Jewish tradition held that the Ark of the Covenant had once rested there, a vessel said to contain the very presence of God. Early Christian legends spoke of hidden texts preserved by followers who feared persecution. Islamic tradition revered the mount as a place of divine ascent and revelation. Every faith layered meaning upon the same stones. If the Templars excavated anything at all, it would have existed at the intersection of belief and danger. Relics are never neutral. They redefine authority. Whoever controls them controls interpretation. One theory suggests the Templars found ancient religious texts, Gospels excluded from the biblical canon, writings that portrayed Jesus not as a distant divine figure, but as a teacher of wisdom, closer to human struggle than celestial perfection. Such texts had circulated in the early centuries of Christianity before being condemned as heretical. If rediscovered, they would have challenged the Church's claim to exclusive spiritual truth. Another theory centers on Jewish mysticism. The Temple Mount was the heart of traditions concerning divine names, cosmic order, and hidden knowledge. Symbols, diagrams, and teachings associated with these traditions were not meant for public consumption. They were transmitted orally to the prepared, to those disciplined enough to understand their implications. The Templars' emphasis on secrecy and initiation resonates uncomfortably with this idea. There are also legends of physical objects, not treasures in the conventional sense, but symbols of authority. The Ark of the Covenant, the menorah, even fragments of Solomon's temple itself. Objects believed to grant legitimacy to kings and priests alike. Yet for all these theories, no artifact has ever been conclusively linked to the Templars. And that absence may be the point. What if the true treasure was not something that could be displayed? What if it was knowledge, dangerous not because it was false, but because it was true in a way that undermined centralized power? Knowledge does not shine. It does not clink. It travels silently, carried in memory, in symbols, in changed behavior. It reshapes priorities. It alters loyalties. And the Templars' behavior did change. After their years in Jerusalem, the order began to emphasize inner discipline over outward devotion. Their rituals grew more austere. Their focus shifted toward structure, hierarchy, and control of information. They became less concerned with spectacle and more invested in continuity. They acted like custodians rather than conquerors. Observers noted that the Templars were unusually calm in the face of loss. When territories fell, they withdrew without panic. When battles were lost, they regrouped without despair. This emotional restraint puzzled contemporaries accustomed to religious fervor and apocalyptic fear. It was as if the Templars possessed a longer view of history, one not anchored to immediate victories or defeats. Their financial practices reflect this mindset as well. Rather than hoarding wealth, they circulated it. They loaned to kings not to dominate them, but to stabilize systems. Their goal seemed to be endurance, not accumulation. Such behavior makes little sense if gold was their ultimate prize. It makes perfect sense if survival of knowledge was. The Church, for its part, was not ignorant of alternative traditions. Early Christian history was filled with debates over doctrine, authority, and interpretation. Councils had chosen which texts would define orthodoxy. Others were labeled dangerous and destroyed. This process created unity, but at a cost. By the time the Templars rose, the Church's authority rested on the assumption that salvation flowed through its institutions. If an independent order possessed teachings that suggested otherwise, even indirectly, that authority weakened. The danger was not rebellion. It was redundancy. If people could encounter God without mediation, the entire structure of medieval Christianity trembled. This is why the accusations against the Templars during their trials focused so intensely on belief rather than action. They were not charged primarily with political conspiracy or military disobedience. They were accused of corrupting the core of faith itself, of knowing something they should not. The infamous idol, often described as a head, sometimes with multiple faces, may not have been an object at all. It could have been a symbol misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented. Some scholars suggest it referred to a concept, the idea of divine wisdom manifesting in human form, an idea present in several suppressed Christian sections. Others see it as a distortion of the Hebrew phrase for father of wisdom, twisted into something sinister for political effect. Regardless of interpretation, the fixation on this supposed idol reveals fear, not evidence. The Templars were accused of worshipping knowledge instead of God. But in a world where knowledge had been carefully curated by authority, that distinction was perilously thin. If the Templars truly believed that truth could be sought through discipline, study, and experience, rather than passively received, they represented a quiet revolution. And revolutions do not always announce themselves with banners. They can exist for centuries, hidden in rituals, in architecture, in silence. The absence of physical treasure in the Templar story has frustrated historians and treasure hunters alike. But absence, too, can be meaningful. Nothing glittered because nothing needed to. What they carried could not be stolen. It could only be passed on carefully, selectively, and invisibly. And when the time came, when power turned against them, gold would not have saved the order. But perhaps knowledge already had. Because even after their destruction, the ideas attributed to the Templars did not disappear. They resurfaced, fragmented, disguised, denied but persistent. And that persistence suggests the greatest treasure the Templars guarded was never meant to be found. It was meant to survive. Poverty was the vow that defined the Knights Templar, at least in theory. Each brother renounced personal wealth, swore to own nothing, and lived under strict rules that punished excess and vanity. And yet, within a century of their founding, the order controlled more resources than most European kingdoms. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Kings rode into battle wearing armor financed by Templar loans. Cathedrals rose with funds safeguarded by their treasuries. Merchants crossed borders carrying letters bearing the Red Cross, knowing that a Templar house would honor them anywhere in Christendom. The brothers who slept on straw mats now managed an economic network that stretched across continents. This transformation did not happen through conquest or exploitation. It happened through trust. In a world without central banks, without standardized currency, and without reliable law enforcement, trust was the most valuable commodity of all. The Templars became its guardians. They were seen as incorruptible, bound by vows, and accountable to no single crown. To entrust them with wealth was to place it beyond ordinary politics. The system they built was quietly revolutionary. A pilgrim could deposit gold at a Templar commandery in Paris and receive a coded document. Weeks later, in Acre or Jerusalem, he could present that document and receive equivalent funds. No gold traveled the dangerous roads. No bandit could steal what did not physically exist. The Templars had created a medieval financial instrument, part receipt, part promise, part encryption. They recorded transactions in private ledgers, written in forms few outsiders could interpret. Their methods were consistent, disciplined, and astonishingly reliable. Losses were rare. Fraud was almost non-existent. Over time, even skeptics were forced to acknowledge their efficiency. Soon, it was not just pilgrims who relied on them. Nobles deposited dowries. Merchants stored profits. Entire monasteries entrusted donations to Templar vaults. And inevitably, kings came knocking. Wars were expensive. Crusades even more so. Monarchs borrowed heavily from the order, often without clear plans for repayment. The Templars did not demand immediate returns. They understood long horizons. Their wealth was not meant to circulate rapidly. It was meant to stabilize. This patience made them indispensable and dangerous. For a medieval king, owing money to another ruler was humiliating but manageable. Owing money to an order that answered only to the Pope, and perhaps to its own internal laws, was something else entirely. The Templars did not threaten. They did not blackmail. They did not flaunt their leverage. But leverage existed nonetheless. And power that does not announce itself is often the most frightening. As their financial reach expanded, so did their physical presence. Commanderies appeared across Europe, fortified yet austere, designed for administration as much as defense. These were not castles of vanity. They were hubs of logistics, record-keeping, and coordination. Information flowed through them as surely as coin. The brothers who managed these houses were not always warriors. Many were skilled administrators, trained to track resources, manage estates, and resolve disputes. They operated with a professionalism rare in a feudal world driven by personal loyalty and inheritance. The order functioned more like a corporation than a brotherhood, a concept centuries ahead of its time. This efficiency unsettled traditional authorities. Bishops resented Templar exemptions from local control. Nobles bristled at their independence. Merchants envied their security. Even other religious orders questioned how men sworn to poverty could wield such material influence. Yet the Church itself benefited enormously. The Templars transported papal funds, safeguarded relics, and financed campaigns endorsed by Rome. Their neutrality made them ideal intermediaries in a fragmented Christendom. For decades, this arrangement suited everyone. Until it didn't. As the Crusader states weakened and the Holy Land slipped from Christian control, the original justification for the order began to fade. The roads they once guarded fell under enemy rule. Pilgrimages declined. Military victories grew rare. What remained was the infrastructure. An order built for war had become an institution of finance and administration. This shift was logical, even necessary, but it changed how others perceived them. The Templars were no longer seen primarily as defenders of faith. They were seen as holders of wealth and holders of secrets. Their ledgers documented debts few kings wanted remembered. Their vaults contained the financial lifelines of entire realms. Their archives recorded transactions that could embarrass, expose, or destabilize. This was not intentional coercion, but it was undeniable influence. And influence without accountability invites fear. King Philip IV of France embodied that fear. He inherited a kingdom strained by war, mismanagement, and ambition. His court was lavish, his campaigns costly, his treasury perpetually empty. Again and again he turned to the Templars for loans. Again and again the debt grew. At first, Philip respected the order. He even entrusted them with royal funds and used their Paris headquarters as a financial center. But reliance breeds resentment. The more dependent he became, the more he resented the position. To a king who believed himself chosen by God, owing his power to an order of monks was intolerable. The church, too, began to reassess. An institution built on spiritual authority had grown comfortable relying on a parallel system of economic power it did not fully control. The Templars' exemption from taxes and secular law, once a practical necessity, now looked like an imbalance. Whispers spread. Accusations took shape. Why did the Templars need so much secrecy? Why did they resist oversight? Why did their internal records remain closed even to bishops? These questions were not proof of wrongdoing, but they created a narrative. And narratives, once established, can be weaponized. The tragedy of the Templars is that they never adapted their image to match their reality. They remained silent, reserved, uninterested in public justification. Their discipline, once admired, now appeared aloof. Their restraint was mistaken for arrogance. They underestimated the power of envy. When the decision was finally made to move against them, their wealth became both motive and excuse. Confiscation would solve royal debts overnight. Redistribution would appease rivals. Moral condemnation would justify the act. But wealth alone does not explain the ferocity of the attack. Plenty of institutions were rich. Few were erased. The difference lay in independence. The Templars had created a system that functioned without constant reference to kings or bishops. They had demonstrated that stability could exist outside traditional hierarchies, that trust could be earned through consistency rather than lineage. This was a subtle challenge, but a profound one. When the hammer fell, it fell not just on a treasury, but on an idea. And yet, even as their assets were seized and their houses emptied, something remained beyond reach. You can confiscate gold. You cannot confiscate the methods, the knowledge, the structures learned over generations. Those traveled with the survivors. They resurfaced in other forms, under other names, in other centuries. Which raises an unsettling question. If the Templars were destroyed because they proved power could exist without permission, what does that say about the forces that destroyed them? By the dawn of the 14th century, the throne of France was heavy with expectation and hollow with debt. King Philip IV ruled a kingdom that appeared powerful from the outside but was rotting beneath its gilded surface. Wars with England had drained the treasury. Conflicts with Flanders had bled both coin and men. The royal court was expensive, relentless in its appetite, and unforgiving in its demands. Every solution Philip pursued seemed to deepen the problem rather than solve it. In this tightening vice, one creditor loomed larger than all others: the Knights Templar. For years, Philip had relied on the order not only as lenders but as financial custodians of the French crown itself. Royal funds were stored within Templar vaults in Paris. Templar accountants tracked the king's revenues and obligations with a precision his own officials struggled to match. The irony was unmistakable. A monarch crowned by divine right increasingly dependent on an order of monks sworn to poverty. At first, this dependence was tolerated, even welcomed. The Templars were efficient, discreet, and loyal to the church. But dependence has a way of curdling into resentment, especially for a ruler whose authority rested on the belief that no power stood above him. Philip was not a man inclined toward humility. He was methodical, calculating, and deeply aware of symbolism. He had already shown his willingness to challenge the church itself when it suited his interests, most famously in his confrontation with Pope Boniface VIII. That clash had ended with the Pope humiliated and dying shortly thereafter. A clear message that Philip did not fear spiritual authority when it conflicted with royal ambition. The Templars, however, represented a more subtle threat. They did not oppose Philip. They did not challenge his laws or question his legitimacy. They simply existed beyond his control. Their wealth was immune to taxation. Their members answered to superiors outside the kingdom. Their records were sealed. Their loyalty lay not with France, but with an international order anchored in Rome, and perhaps in something even older. For a king obsessed with sovereignty, This was intolerable. Worse still, Philip's debts to the Templars were not abstract. They were documented, recorded, known. In a medieval world where honor and reputation were currency, owing vast sums to a religious order undermined the image of absolute power Philip worked tirelessly to project. A king in debt was a king diminished. Philip's solution was not negotiation. It was elimination. But eliminating the Templars required more than swords. They were too respected, too entrenched, too protected by papal authority. To move against them openly would risk rebellion, excommunication, and chaos. What Philip needed was a narrative, one powerful enough to justify annihilation. Heresy provided that narrative. Accusations against the Templars did not arise organically from popular outrage. They were constructed carefully and deliberately within the machinery of royal administration. Informants were encouraged. Rumors were collected. Former members, often disgruntled or desperate, were interrogated until their stories aligned with expectation. The charges were designed to shock, to disgust, to bypass rational debate and trigger fear. Denying Christ, spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, engaging in obscene rituals. These were not crimes that invited investigation, they demanded immediate action. And Philip moved with ruthless precision. On a single day across the entire kingdom, arrest orders were executed. The coordination was unprecedented. Warrants had been sealed in advance, their contents hidden even from the officials tasked with delivering them. This secrecy ensured obedience and prevented warning. It was not the action of a man improvising. It was the culmination of long preparation. Publicly, Philip framed the arrests as an act of piety. Privately, he moved swiftly to seize Templar assets, appoint royal administrators, and secure control of properties. The debts he owed were effectively erased overnight. The financial problem that had plagued his reign vanished in smoke and iron. Yet greed alone cannot explain the intensity of Philip's actions. If money were the only motive, the order could have been absorbed, restructured, or subordinated. Instead, it was obliterated, its leadership destroyed, its reputation poisoned beyond repair. This suggests something deeper at work. Philip was a man who understood the power of ideas. He knew that institutions survive not by force alone, but by belief. And the Templars possessed a belief system, or at least the appearance of one, that did not depend on kings. They had proven that loyalty could be organized without crowns, that trust could be earned without bloodlines, that authority could flow from discipline and knowledge rather than divine appointment through monarchy. In subtle ways, they represented an alternative model of power. This was intolerable to a ruler who believed the state must be absolute. The Pope's role in this drama is telling. Clement V was cautious, hesitant, visibly uncomfortable with Philip's campaign. He delayed, questioned, and attempted to assert papal jurisdiction over the order. But Philip controlled the ground. The arrests had already occurred. The confessions, extracted under torture, were already recorded. Reality had been shaped before Rome could respond. Eventually, Clement capitulated, not necessarily because he believed the accusations, but because resisting them threatened schism. The unity of the Church was placed on the scales against the fate of the Templars. Philip understood this leverage perfectly. In the end, the trials became theater. The verdicts predetermined. The outcome inevitable. Jacques de Molay's execution was not just the death of a man. It was a warning. No institution, no matter how sacred, could exist outside royal reach. Yet history has a way of judging motives long after power fades. Philip's reign did not end in triumph. His sons died young. The Capetian line collapsed within a generation. France descended into instability that would culminate in war and plague. Whether coincidence or consequence, the pattern unsettled even medieval observers. The king who had destroyed the Templars solved his immediate problems. He secured wealth, eliminated a rival, and asserted dominance over church and order alike. But in doing so, he exposed a truth as old as power itself. Fear, not faith, drove his hand. Fear of debt. Fear of independence. Fear that the world he ruled was changing in ways he could not control. And so, a king who owed money to God's soldiers chose to erase them instead. The decision reshaped history, not because it was righteous, but because it revealed how fragile authority becomes when it encounters knowledge it cannot command. Once the machinery of accusation began to turn, it did not slow down. It accelerated, feeding on fear, rumor, and the medieval church's deepest anxieties. What emerged was not a careful investigation, but a storm of whispers given official voice. The word that came to define the Knights Templar in the public imagination was not traitor or criminal, but something far more devastating in a religious world: heretic. Heresy was not simply error. It was infection. To be labeled a heretic was to be declared spiritually dangerous, capable of corrupting others merely by existing. And the accusations leveled against the Templars were crafted with surgical precision to provoke horror rather than scrutiny. They struck at the heart of Christian identity, targeting symbols and beliefs so sacred that any alleged violation demanded immediate condemnation. The charges followed a pattern. New initiates, it was said, were ordered to renounce Christ in secret. They were told to spit upon the cross, sometimes to trample it underfoot. They were instructed to deny the crucifixion, to treat it as a lie meant for the uninitiated. These acts, allegedly performed behind closed doors, were said to bind the initiate more tightly to the order than to God. To medieval ears, this was unthinkable. The cross was not just a symbol. It was the axis of salvation. To desecrate it was to reject Christ himself. No explanation could redeem such an act. The accusation alone was enough to destroy reputations centuries in the making. But the accusations did not stop there. The Templars were also charged with worshipping an idol, a mysterious head, sometimes described as bearded, sometimes with multiple faces, sometimes made of wood, sometimes of metal. This object, referred to in later records as Baphomet, became the centerpiece of the case against them. No two descriptions of this idol were the same. Some claimed it granted wealth. Others said it ensured fertility of crops. Still others insisted it was a demon. The contradictions were glaring, yet they were ignored. In a climate of fear, consistency mattered less than spectacle. The Church had fought idol worship for centuries. To accuse a powerful Christian order of secretly venerating false gods was to place them beyond redemption. And then there were the more lurid allegations. Initiates were said to engage in obscene kisses, on the mouth, the navel, even the base of the spine, as acts of submission. The order was accused of encouraging unnatural acts, of rejecting marriage not for purity, but for perversion. These claims tapped into a familiar strategy, to frame secrecy as deviance. What people do not understand, they often assume to be immoral. Under modern scrutiny, these accusations collapse quickly. They emerge almost exclusively under torture. They are riddled with inconsistencies. They mirror charges leveled against earlier persecuted groups, Gnostics, Cathars, even early Christians under Roman rule. This repetition is not coincidence. Throughout history, institutions under threat have often accused their enemies of the same crimes, regardless of era or culture. Secret meetings become conspiracies. Rituals become perversions. Silence becomes guilt. The Templars fit the pattern perfectly. Their initiations were private. Their rule demanded secrecy. Their inner hierarchy was opaque even to friendly bishops. To an anxious church already struggling to maintain doctrinal unity, this was intolerable. What made the accusations especially effective was how they reframed Templar discipline as deception. The very qualities that had once inspired trust, silence, restraint, obedience, were now cast as proof of corruption. Their refusal to explain themselves publicly was interpreted not as humility, but as concealment. Once this interpretation took hold, every denial sounded rehearsed. Yet beneath the sensationalism, a more subtle accusation lurked, one that reveals the true fear behind the trials. The Templars were accused not only of denying Christ, but of redefining him. Some testimonies claimed they believed Christ was not divine. Others suggested they saw him as a teacher rather than a savior. Still others implied they believed salvation came through knowledge and discipline rather than sacraments. These ideas were not invented in the 14th century. They echoed debates from Christianity's earliest days, debates Rome believed it had settled. To accuse the Templars of reviving these interpretations was to accuse them of reopening wounds the Church had spent a millennium closing. This explains why the trials focused so intensely on belief rather than behavior. If the Templars had simply been corrupt, they could have been reformed. If they had been greedy, they could have been punished. But if they believed something fundamentally different about Christ and salvation, they represented an existential threat. And existential threats demand eradication. The role of torture in producing these confessions cannot be overstated. Medieval interrogators did not seek truth as we understand it. They sought affirmation of a pre-existing narrative. Pain was a tool not for discovery, but for confirmation. Under such conditions, consistency was impossible. Some brothers confessed to everything, others to nothing. Some recanted as soon as torture ceased. Others stood by their words, broken and desperate, believing confession was the only path to survival. And yet, even within this chaos, patterns emerge. Interrogators repeatedly returned to questions of initiation, of secret teachings, of objects revered within the order. This suggests the authorities were not fishing blindly. They were hunting for something specific, something they believed existed. Perhaps they had heard rumors long before Philip's arrests. Perhaps informants had described fragments of rituals misunderstood or deliberately distorted. Or perhaps the idea of hidden knowledge itself was enough to provoke fear. In a church built on revelation controlled by hierarchy, any independent claim to truth was suspect. Public reaction was swift and brutal. The average believer did not demand evidence. The accusations alone were enough. Once the word heresy was spoken, compassion evaporated. Templars who had once been praised as defenders of Christ were now shunned as traitors to him. Fear rewrote memory. Men who had given alms to the order hurried to distance themselves. Nobles seized lands once donated in piety. Churches removed Templar symbols. No one wanted to be associated with a condemned order. The silence of the Templars during this period only deepened suspicion. Bound by vows and stripped of authority, many could not defend themselves effectively. Their words were filtered through hostile courts. Their protests dismissed as deception. To speak too forcefully risked further condemnation. To remain silent sealed their fate. What is striking, looking back, is how little effort was made to resolve contradictions. No attempt to reconcile conflicting testimonies. No systematic evaluation of evidence. The trials were not designed to determine guilt. They were designed to legitimize a decision already made. Heresy was the perfect weapon. It required no proof beyond confession. It allowed seizure of property. It justified execution. And most importantly, it transformed political convenience into moral necessity. By the time the Church formally dissolved the order, the public had already accepted the narrative. The Templars were no longer men. They were symbols of corruption, warnings of what happened when secrecy and faith mixed too freely. Yet symbols have a way of unraveling. Centuries later, when scholars began examining the records without fear, the case collapsed under its own weight. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The order was gone. Still, one question lingers, uncomfortable and unresolved. If the accusations were false, why were they so specific? Why did they echo suppressed traditions so closely? Why did they focus not on crimes of power, but on crimes of belief? Perhaps the accusations tell us less about what the Templars did, and more about what their enemies feared they might know. In that sense, the whispers of heresy were not merely lies. They were distorted reflections of a truth too dangerous to confront directly. Pain has a way of rearranging reality. Under its weight, memory bends, conviction fractures, and the boundary between truth and survival disappears entirely. This was the unspoken understanding behind medieval justice, where suffering was not a tragic byproduct of interrogation but its central instrument. For the Knights Templar, the ordeal that followed their arrests was not designed to uncover what happened. It was designed to force what needed to be said. The prisons that held the brothers were cold, damp, and deliberately isolating. Many had never been confined before. Men who had marched across deserts and survived sieges now found themselves chained in darkness, cut off from prayer, routine, and each other. Sleep was irregular. Food was scarce. Silence pressed in from all sides. Even before torture began, resistance weakened. When interrogations started, they followed a grimly familiar script. The accused were presented with statements already written, accusations already formed. They were not asked open questions. They were asked to confirm. Did you deny Christ? Did you spit upon the cross? Did you worship the head? The implication was clear. The answers were expected. Pain would follow hesitation. Torture was not chaotic brutality. It was procedural, carefully measured, authorized by both royal and ecclesiastical courts. The goal was not death, but compliance. Broken bones could heal. Confessions, once recorded, were permanent. The rack stretched bodies until joints separated with wet, unmistakable sounds. The strappado hoisted men by bound arms, dislocating shoulders while weights were added slowly, almost gently. Fire was used sparingly, enough to terrify, not enough to kill. The water torture suffocated without leaving marks. Each method carried a lesson. Resistance only prolonged suffering. Under such conditions, confessions poured forth. Some brothers confessed to everything they were accused of. Others invented details they thought their interrogators wanted to hear. Many repeated rumors they had heard secondhand, mistaking hearsay for personal experience. In a world where survival depended on compliance, imagination became a shield. The tragedy lies not in the confessions themselves, but in how they were used. Once spoken, these words were treated as evidence, regardless of the circumstances. Retractions were dismissed as lies. Claims of innocence were interpreted as further proof of guilt. The logic was circular and absolute. And yet, within the chaos, something curious emerges. The interrogators were not equally interested in all accusations. They lingered on certain themes. They returned again and again to questions of initiation rituals, secret teachings, and the inner hierarchy of the order. They wanted names, symbols, explanations. It was as if they were trying to map a hidden structure. This suggests that the trials were not merely reactive. They were investigative in a specific direction. Someone believed the Templars possessed forbidden knowledge, and the machinery of torture was turned toward extracting it. What they found instead was confusion. Confessions contradicted one another wildly. One brother described an idol made of wood. Another swore it was metal. Some said it had one face. Others said three. Some claimed it spoke. Others said it did nothing at all. A few admitted they had never seen it, but had heard of it from others. If a real object existed, it left no consistent trace. The same inconsistency plagued claims of ritual denial of Christ. Some said it occurred once, others at every initiation. Some said it was symbolic. Others said it was literal. A few insisted they had refused and been punished. Others claimed they complied without understanding why. What unites these testimonies is not coherence, but desperation. When torture paused, something remarkable often happened. Brothers recanted. They declared their confessions false. They spoke calmly, clearly, and with conviction. They explained that they had said what they said to end the pain. They reaffirmed their faith. Some even begged for the opportunity to prove their innocence publicly. These recantations were ignored. The courts argued that confessions extracted under torture were valid because the pain compelled truth. Modern sensibilities recoil at this logic, but it was standard practice at the time. Pain, it was believed, stripped away deception and revealed the soul. This belief was convenient, because it meant the outcome of the trials could never change. The most haunting moments in the records come from those who refused to confess. Men who endured torture and still denied the charges. Their bodies broke. Their voices failed. But their words did not change. These men were often sentenced more harshly than those who confessed. To the authorities, refusal was not innocence. It was obstinacy, and obstinacy threatened the legitimacy of the entire process. A system built on coerced confession cannot tolerate genuine resistance. The trials dragged on for years. Time itself became a weapon. Brothers aged in cells. Some died of disease. Others lost their sanity. A few, broken beyond hope, accepted the narrative imposed upon them, believing perhaps that the order truly had been corrupt and that they had simply been blind. This psychological collapse is one of the darkest legacies of the persecution. Yet even in this bleak landscape, the trials failed to uncover what they sought. If the Templars possessed a unified heretical doctrine, it remained elusive. If they guarded a central object or text, it never surfaced. If there was an inner circle holding forbidden knowledge, its members did not reveal it, or it did not exist in the form imagined. What emerged instead was a portrait of an order bound by discipline and silence, not by shared heresy. The very structure that had made the Templars effective now shielded them from complete exposure. Brothers knew their roles, not the whole. They obeyed without demanding explanation. Information was compartmentalized. This was not conspiracy. It was operational necessity. But to outside eyes, it looked like concealment. As the years passed, the trials lost urgency. Public interest waned. New crises arose. The fate of the Templars became a bureaucratic problem rather than a moral crusade. Many were quietly released, assigned penance, or absorbed into other orders. The leaders, however, were not spared. When Jacques de Molay and other senior figures were finally brought to judgment, the charade reached its end. De Molay initially confessed under pressure, then publicly recanted, declaring the order innocent and the confessions false. This act sealed his fate. Recantation threatened the entire narrative. If the Grand Master himself rejected the accusations, the trials unraveled. The response was swift. He was condemned as a relapsed heretic and burned alive. Fire, unlike torture, left no recantations. The official story closed with smoke rising over the Seine. The records were filed. The order dissolved. History moved on. But torture leaves residues. It distorts not only testimony, but memory itself. Centuries later, historians still struggle to separate what the Templars might have believed from what they were forced to say. The trial records are vast, detailed, and fundamentally unreliable. And yet, they remain one of the primary sources we have. This creates a troubling paradox. Our understanding of the Templars' supposed heresy comes almost entirely from words spoken under unbearable pain. Words shaped by fear, by expectation, by the desperate need for relief. If truth matters, this should disturb us deeply. Because if the foundations of the case were built on suffering rather than evidence, then the destruction of the order was not a judgment. It was an execution. And executions, no matter how carefully justified, tell us more about the fears of the executioners than the guilt of the condemned. At the center of the storm stood a man who never truly wanted it. Pope Clement V was not a crusader pope, nor a reformer carved from iron conviction. He was cautious, politically exposed, and acutely aware that every decision he made could fracture the fragile balance between spiritual authority and royal power. When news of the mass arrests reached him, his first response was not outrage at the Templars, but alarm at the King of France. Because Clement immediately understood the implications. If a secular ruler could arrest a papally sanctioned order without consultation, then papal supremacy was already compromised. The issue was larger than the Templars. It was about who ultimately commanded Christendom. Clement's early letters reveal hesitation bordering on fear. He demanded explanations from Philip. He reminded the king that the Templars answered directly to Rome. He insisted that any investigation fall under papal jurisdiction. These were not the words of a man convinced of guilt. They were the words of someone trying to regain control of a situation already slipping away. But Philip had moved too fast. By the time Clement reacted, confessions had been extracted, rumors had spread, and public opinion had been primed. The narrative was already fixed. The Templars were heretics, and the king had acted decisively to protect the faith. To challenge this openly would not only undermine Philip, but risk portraying the papacy as defending heresy. Clement was trapped. Privately, he was deeply uneasy. He authorized his own inquiry, separate from the French proceedings, and the results were troubling. When papal investigators questioned Templars outside France, without torture, the confessions largely disappeared. Many brothers denied the charges outright. Others admitted only to minor procedural irregularities, not doctrinal corruption. The contrast was impossible to ignore. If the order were truly heretical at its core, why did guilt evaporate when pain was removed from the process? Clement saw this clearly. Surviving documents suggest he doubted the most serious accusations, especially those involving idol worship and denial of Christ. Yet doubt did not equal freedom. Philip exerted relentless pressure. He reminded Clement of France's military power, its influence over church politics, and its role as defender of the faith. The memory of Pope Boniface VIII, assaulted by agents of the French crown and dead soon after, hovered like a warning. Clement understood what defiance could cost. So he delayed. Delay became his strategy. He postponed councils. He ordered further investigations. He sought compromise solutions that might preserve papal authority without provoking royal retaliation. To the outside world, this hesitation appeared weak. To Clement, it was survival. Behind the scenes, something even more revealing occurred. A confidential papal commission interrogated high-ranking Templars, including Jacques de Molay himself. These interrogations were conducted under oath, without torture. The resulting testimonies were far more restrained than those recorded in France. De Molay admitted that certain initiation rituals were unusual and secretive, but he denied heresy. He reaffirmed belief in Christ and obedience to the Church. These statements mattered, so much so that they were sealed. The records of this inquiry were not publicized. They were archived quietly, inaccessible for centuries. Clement did not use them to exonerate the order, but neither did he destroy them. Instead, he chose a third path, one that would define his legacy. At the Council of Vienne in 1312, Clement dissolved the Knights Templar. Not through condemnation, through suppression. This distinction is crucial. The order was disbanded not because it was proven heretical, but because its continued existence was deemed scandalous and divisive. In other words, it was politically inconvenient. Clement avoided declaring the Templars guilty of heresy, a move that would have required incontrovertible proof, but he also avoided declaring them innocent. He sacrificed the institution to preserve the institution of the Church. This was a papal compromise born of fear. The Templars were stripped of their identity, their properties transferred largely to the Hospitallers, their name erased from official use. But they were not formally condemned as heretics by papal decree. This ambiguity has haunted historians ever since. If the Pope believed the Templars were guilty, why avoid a clear verdict? And if he believed they were innocent, why destroy them at all? The answer lies in what Clement feared more than heresy: schism. Openly exonerating the Templars would have directly challenged Philip IV, potentially plunging Christendom into chaos. Declaring them definitively heretical would have validated torture-tainted evidence and set a dangerous precedent for royal manipulation of doctrine. So Clement chose silence wrapped in bureaucracy. His decision ended the order, but left its moral status unresolved. It was a quiet burial rather than a public execution. And yet, silence is not neutral. By failing to speak clearly, Clement allowed the narrative of guilt to persist. Public memory does not preserve nuance. The average believer did not distinguish between suppression and condemnation. The Templars vanished, and their disappearance itself became proof in the eyes of many. Guilt, once assumed, rarely requires reinforcement. Clement's hesitation extended even to the final executions. When Jacques de Molay and other leaders were condemned as relapsed heretics for recanting earlier confessions, Clement did not intervene decisively. Whether he lacked the power or the will remains debated. What is clear is that he did not act. This inaction sealed the tragedy. Centuries later, when historians gained access to sealed Vatican documents, Clement's private doubts resurfaced. The Chinon parchment, rediscovered in the 20th century, revealed that Clement had absolved the Templar leadership of heresy in private. The order's highest members had been reconciled to the Church, quietly, without public announcement. This revelation reframed everything. It suggested that the Pope never believed the Templars were true heretics, that he saw the accusations as exaggerated, coerced, or politically motivated. And yet, knowing this, he still allowed the order to be destroyed. The implications are unsettling. The fate of the Templars was not decided by truth, but by expediency. Not by theology, but by pressure. Clement's greatest failure was not moral blindness, but moral paralysis. He stood at a crossroads and chose the path of least resistance. In doing so, he preserved the appearance of unity at the cost of justice. He prevented open conflict between crown and papacy, but allowed an ancient order to be erased without full vindication or condemnation. History often judges tyrants harshly and compromises gently. But Clement's legacy forces a harder question. What happens when those entrusted with truth choose silence instead? Because silence, when backed by authority, can be as destructive as any lie. And for the Knights Templar, the Pope's hesitation did not save them. It merely ensured that their destruction would forever be wrapped in uncertainty, a quiet admission that something about their fall was never entirely honest. Behind the public trials, the shouting crowds, and the carefully staged confessions, another process was unfolding, one that almost no one at the time was meant to know about. While kings and inquisitors argued in the open, a quieter inquiry moved through sealed chambers and whispered corridors, hidden from the very world it was meant to judge. This was the trial within the trial, and it may hold the clearest indication that the destruction of the Knights Templar was never as simple as it appeared. Pope Clement V understood that the French proceedings were irreparably compromised. Torture had tainted testimony. Royal influence saturated every judgment. If the Church was to preserve even the illusion of spiritual authority, it needed its own evaluation, one not dictated by fear of Philip IV's armies. So Clement authorized a confidential papal commission. Its mandate was narrow and deliberately obscured. High-ranking Templars were to be examined in secrecy, away from French control, and without the use of torture. The goal was not spectacle but clarity. These men were not common brothers repeating rumors under pain. They were the leadership of the order, individuals who, if heresy truly existed, would know its shape and purpose. The location chosen for these interrogations was Chinon, a fortress far from Parisian mobs. There, Jacques de Molay, Hugh de Perraud, Geoffrey de Charnay, and other senior figures were brought before papal envoys. What happened in those chambers was recorded and then buried. The tone of these proceedings was markedly different. The questions were precise, focused not on salacious rumors but on doctrine. The accused were asked about their belief in Christ, the Trinity, the sacraments. They were asked to explain the purpose of their initiation rituals, the meaning of secrecy, the nature of their obedience. Their answers were calm. They acknowledged irregular practices. They admitted that initiation rites included symbolic gestures not explained to new members. They conceded that secrecy was enforced rigorously, sometimes without justification given to the initiate. But they denied heresy. They affirmed their faith. They expressed loyalty to the Church. They explained that discipline and silence were tools of unity, not rebellion. That symbolic acts were misinterpreted by outsiders unfamiliar with their context. Crucially, when pressed about idols, they denied worship. Some acknowledged hearing rumors within the order, but insisted these were misunderstandings or symbolic references, not objects of devotion. This was not the testimony of men hiding a dark secret. It was the testimony of men accustomed to secrecy and now struggling to translate it into language others could understand. The papal commissioners listened. They weighed contradictions. They compared these statements to the chaotic confessions extracted under torture elsewhere. The difference was stark. And then, something extraordinary happened. The commission absolved the Templar leadership. Not publicly, not triumphantly, quietly. They granted absolution for any procedural sins committed under duress. They reconciled the accused with the Church. They restored them spiritually, acknowledging that whatever irregularities existed did not rise to the level of heresy. This absolution was recorded, and then it was sealed. The document known today as the Shinon parchment disappeared into the Vatican archives, untouched and unknown for centuries. No public announcement followed. No correction of the narrative occurred. The trials continued as if the papal inquiry had never happened. Why? Because to reveal the findings would have detonated the fragile balance Clement was trying to maintain. If the Pope publicly absolved the Templars, he would directly contradict the French crown, invalidating years of arrests, confessions, and executions. Philip IV's authority would be humiliated. His justification for seizing Templar assets would collapse. The consequences could have been catastrophic. So Clement chose concealment. He separated spiritual judgment from institutional survival. In his private conscience, the Templars were not heretics. In public policy, they were expendable. This duality explains the strange language of the order's dissolution. The Templars were not condemned. They were suppressed. Their sins were acknowledged vaguely, never specified clearly. The emphasis was on scandal, not doctrine. The papacy washed its hands without cleaning the wound. The secrecy of the Shinon inquiry reveals something profound about the Church's internal struggle. Clement was not defending truth against power. He was negotiating between them, and truth lost. The existence of a hidden trial within the trial exposes the theatrical nature of the public proceedings. The outcome was never about evidence. It was about containment. The Church needed to eliminate the problem without admitting it had misjudged it. The Templars had become too large, too independent, too controversial to save without cost. So they were erased, quietly, bureaucratically, and with deliberate ambiguity. The men who knew the truth were silenced. Some died in prison. Others were executed after recanting confessions, recantations that directly contradicted the papal absolution now buried in Rome. The irony is devastating. The highest authorities of the Church privately forgave the order while allowing its members to burn as heretics. This is not speculation. It is documented. Yet even this knowledge does not provide complete clarity. The Shinon parchment does not tell us what the Templars believed in their hearts. It tells us what the Church was willing to acknowledge, and what it was willing to hide. The fact that Clement chose secrecy over transparency suggests he feared the implications of full disclosure. Perhaps he believed that even if the Templars were not heretics, their methods and independence posed an unacceptable risk to ecclesiastical control. Or perhaps he suspected that deeper truths lay buried within the order, truths that were not heretical but destabilizing. Truth can be dangerous even when it is not false. The existence of a secret papal absolution reframes the entire narrative of the Templars' fall. It transforms their story from one of religious corruption to one of political sacrifice. They were not destroyed because they were proven guilty, but because their innocence was inconvenient. History often remembers verdicts, not processes. It remembers outcomes, not compromises made behind closed doors. The Shinon inquiry reminds us that power prefers silence when truth threatens structure. For centuries, the Vatican archives preserved this silence. Scholars speculated. Legends flourished. Treasure hunters searched for artifacts, while the real revelation lay in a forgotten document. When it finally resurfaced, it did not resolve the mystery. It deepened it. Because if the Church itself quietly absolved the Templars, then the question is no longer whether they were heretics. The question becomes, what did they represent that made absolution insufficient to save them? And what other truths, sealed in archives or erased from memory, have met the same fate? Not because they were wrong, but because they were too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Among all the accusations leveled against the Knights Templar, none captured the imagination or the fear of medieval Europe quite like the name whispered in court records and torture chambers: Baphomet. The word itself sounded alien, unsettling, as if it had crawled out of a darker world beyond Christendom. To invoke it was to suggest demonology, idolatry, and secret pacts with forces opposed to God. Once that name entered the narrative, the fate of the order was effectively sealed. And yet, when examined closely, Baphomet dissolves into ambiguity. No contemporary image of this supposed idol exists. No physical description remains consistent. No artifact was ever produced before a court or a bishop. Everything we think we know about Baphomet comes from confessions extracted under torture, testimonies riddled with contradiction, confusion, and fear. Some described a bearded head. Others said it had multiple faces. A few claimed it spoke. Many admitted they had never seen it at all, only heard of it from others. The idol's powers varied wildly depending on who was speaking and how much pain they were in. This alone should raise suspicion. In medieval inquisitions, true heretical cults left patterns. Shared symbols, repeated rituals, consistent doctrine. Baphomet left only fragments, shadows, echoes, which suggests that Baphomet may never have been an object at all. One of the earliest clues lies in the word itself. Baphomet does not appear in Christian theology prior to the Templar trials. It has no clear Latin or Greek root. But when scholars later examined it through the lens of medieval linguistics, an unsettling possibility emerged. Baphomet may be a corruption. Some suggest it was a distorted rendering of Muhammad, the medieval European name for the prophet Muhammad. During the Crusades, Christians often accused Muslims of worshipping idols, an ironic misunderstanding of Islamic monotheism. To associate the Templars with Baphomet could have been a way of implying that prolonged contact with the Islamic world had corrupted their faith. This interpretation turns the accusation into a cultural slur rather than a theological fact. Others propose a more subtle origin. Read backward using medieval cipher traditions. Baphomet can be rearranged to form the Latin phrase Templi omnium hominum pacis abos, Father of the Temple of Peace of all men. Whether this was intentional or coincidence remains debated, but the symbolism is striking. It suggests not a demon but an idea, a unifying principle that transcends institutional boundaries. There is also the possibility that Baphomet refers not to worship but to wisdom. In several ancient traditions, the head symbolized knowledge rather than divinity. Severed heads were believed to contain power, memory, and insight. In some esoteric philosophies, the head represented the seat of enlightenment, the place where divine understanding entered the human form. If the Templars spoke of a head, it may have been metaphorical, not literal. Under torture, metaphor becomes monstrosity. The Church, for centuries, had struggled to suppress alternative paths to knowledge. Gnostic sects emphasized inner enlightenment. Jewish mysticism explored divine names and cosmic structures. Islamic philosophers preserved and expanded upon Greek thought. All of these traditions shared a dangerous premise: that truth could be sought through study and experience, not just obedience. If the Templars absorbed even fragments of this worldview, they would have stood dangerously close to forbidden ground. Baphomet, then, could have been a cipher, a label imposed upon ideas that could not be openly discussed. This explains why interrogators fixated on it. They were not searching for a statue. They were searching for meaning, for proof that the order had crossed a line from acceptable secrecy into unacceptable independence. The irony is painful. The more the Templars struggled to explain symbolic or philosophical concepts to hostile interrogators, the more those concepts were distorted into accusations of demon worship. Language failed. The Church had a long history of equating unapproved symbolism with heresy. Anything not sanctioned by doctrine was suspect. Anything not publicly explained was dangerous. The Templars' internal culture, shaped by silence and discipline, was ill-suited to defend itself against such scrutiny. To say "you would not understand" was interpreted as guilt. To say nothing was interpreted as confession. What makes the Baphomet accusation especially revealing is how quickly it overshadowed all other charges. Financial misconduct, political intrigue, even violence faded into the background. Baphomet became the centerpiece because it spoke to the deepest fear of the medieval Church: loss of interpretive monopoly. If a group of monks could claim access to divine truth through symbols, rituals, or knowledge outside Church control, the entire hierarchy was threatened. It did not matter whether the threat was real. It mattered that it was plausible. The later evolution of Baphomet in popular imagination, the goat-headed figure associated with modern occultism, has nothing to do with the Templars. That image emerged centuries later, shaped by artists and polemicists far removed from medieval reality. Projecting it backward is a mistake. The medieval Baphomet was vague by design. Its ambiguity made it useful. It could mean whatever the accuser needed it to mean. Demon, idol, philosophy, heresy. The lack of clarity was its strength. Even within the church, discomfort lingered. Some theologians questioned the credibility of the idol narrative. Others noted that no physical evidence had ever been produced. But by then, the accusation had done its work. It had transformed the Templars from a political problem into a spiritual menace. And spiritual menaces do not require proof. What is perhaps most telling is that when the Papal Commission secretly absolved the Templar leadership, Baphomet disappeared from serious theological discussion. It was not addressed, not debated, not resolved. It was simply set aside, as if even acknowledging it too directly was dangerous. This silence suggests that Baphomet touched something sensitive, not because it represented evil, but because it represented ambiguity. A space where doctrine blurred into philosophy, where obedience encountered inquiry. For an institution built on clarity and control, ambiguity was intolerable. If the Templars did speak of wisdom in symbolic terms, if they preserved ideas that emphasized inner understanding over outward conformity, then Baphomet was never a god. It was a mirror reflecting the Church's fear that faith, once untethered from authority, could evolve into something uncontrollable. In the end, the name Baphomet tells us more about the accusers than the accused. It reveals how easily unfamiliar ideas are demonized when power feels threatened, how quickly symbols become weapons when understanding fails, and how history, shaped by fear, can turn silence into proof of guilt. The greatest irony is this: if Baphomet truly existed as an idol, it vanished completely. If it existed as an idea, it survived quietly, persistently, beyond the reach of fire and confession. And perhaps that is the real reason the name still unsettles us. Because ideas once born cannot be burned. Long before Rome declared itself the final authority on Christian truth, belief was fluid, contested, and alive with debate. The earliest followers of Jesus did not inherit a single, unified doctrine. They argued, interpreted, disagreed, and wrote. Communities spread across the Mediterranean world, each shaped by culture, language, and circumstance. Some emphasized faith. Others emphasized knowledge. Some saw Jesus as divine. Others saw him as a teacher chosen by God. When the Church eventually consolidated power, it did so by choosing one path and sealing off the others. Texts that supported orthodoxy were preserved. Those that complicated it were condemned. The process was not sudden or clean. It unfolded over centuries, marked by councils, edicts, and erasures. Entire traditions vanished not because they lacked followers, but because they threatened unity. This history matters because the Knights Templar emerged not in ignorance of it, but in its shadow. The Templars lived and operated in the Holy Land, a region saturated with the remnants of early Christianity, ancient monasteries, forgotten sections, communities that had survived outside Roman control for centuries. These groups preserved traditions the Western Church barely remembered, let alone sanctioned. Exposure changes perspective. Templar Knights encountered Eastern Christians who rejected papal authority yet considered themselves fully faithful. They met scholars who read scriptures Rome had excluded. They heard interpretations of Christ's message that emphasized wisdom, humility, and inner transformation rather than institutional obedience. None of this required rebellion. It required listening. The order structure encouraged exactly that. Templars were trained to observe rather than react, to absorb information without rushing to judgment, to adapt strategies rather than cling to dogma. These qualities made them effective soldiers and receptive minds. There is no evidence that the Templars formally adopted a single alternative theology. But there is strong circumstantial evidence that they became aware of theological possibilities the Church preferred forgotten. That awareness alone was dangerous. One recurring theme in accusations and speculation is that the Templars believed in a form of Christianity older than Rome's. Not corrupted, but unfiltered. A faith stripped of hierarchy, centered on personal discipline and understanding. Such a belief would not necessarily reject Christ's divinity, but it might redefine what that divinity meant. In several suppressed early Christian traditions, Jesus was seen as a revealer of divine knowledge rather than a sacrificial intermediary. Salvation came through awakening, not absolution. Authority resided in understanding, not ordination. These ideas were not fringe. They were widespread in the first centuries of Christianity before being systematically excluded. The Templars' emphasis on secrecy, initiation, and inner hierarchy mirrors these traditions uncannily. Not in content, perhaps, but in method. Knowledge was not broadcast. It was earned. Progression required discipline, not belief alone. This model of faith is fundamentally incompatible with institutional control. The Church claimed exclusive access to salvation through sacraments administered by clergy. If individuals could cultivate spiritual authority through practice and understanding, the Church's role shifted from gatekeeper to guide, a profound loss of power. It is not difficult to imagine why such ideas, if suspected, would provoke alarm. Jerusalem itself intensified this danger. Beneath its streets lay layers of suppressed history: Jewish, Christian, Islamic. The Temple Mount was not just a location. It was a convergence point of traditions obsessed with divine presence, sacred knowledge, and cosmic order. Living there invited reflection. Some scholars have suggested that the Templars encountered remnants of Jewish mystical thought, concepts involving divine names, emanations, and the structure of reality. These ideas emphasized inner transformation and ethical discipline over external ritual. If true, the appeal to the Templars would have been practical rather than mystical. Such systems valued structure, hierarchy, and discipline, qualities the order already embodied. The synthesis of martial order and contemplative discipline is rare in Western tradition. The Templars represented it uniquely. This may explain why later generations associated them with secret wisdom. Not because they sought it for its own sake, but because their way of life created space for it. The Church's fear of such synthesis is understandable. Faith mixed with inquiry produces autonomy. Autonomy undermines obedience. The accusations against the Templars often blurred the line between belief and knowledge. They were said to privilege understanding over faith, initiation over conversion, silence over preaching. These traits, interpreted generously, reflect philosophical humility. Interpreted harshly, they resemble heresy. Which interpretation prevailed depended on who held power. What is striking is how consistently the Templars refused to articulate a theological defense during their trials. They did not counter accusations with elaborate doctrine. They did not argue scripture. They reaffirmed loyalty and faith, but avoided deeper explanation. This restraint suggests either guilt or wisdom. Explaining alternative frameworks to hostile interrogators rarely ends well. Words are twisted. Nuance is lost. Silence, though dangerous, may have seemed safer. There is also the possibility that the Templars understood something uncomfortable. That truth, once exposed to political necessity, becomes vulnerable. Better to protect it by not naming it. The idea that the Templars preserved an older Christianity does not require conspiracy. It requires only continuity. Ideas survive when they are useful, meaningful, and adaptable. The order's longevity suggests it found a balance between tradition and innovation. It operated effectively across cultures without imposing uniform belief. It maintained internal cohesion without public dogma. This is not how heretical cults behave. It is how pragmatic institutions evolve. And yet, pragmatism itself can be threatening. The Church relied on clear boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy, belief and disbelief. The Templars blurred those boundaries by living them rather than defining them. The result was suspicion. After their fall, fragments of their supposed worldview appear in unexpected places. In later chivalric orders. In philosophical movements emphasizing discipline and inner transformation. In myths of secret brotherhoods preserving ancient wisdom. These echoes may be coincidence, or they may reflect the persistence of ideas too practical to vanish. History rarely destroys concepts entirely. It buries them, distorts them, forces them to adapt. If the Templars did preserve elements of an older Christianity, They did so not as rebels, but as custodians. Their crime was not defiance, but relevance. They reminded the world that faith once existed before bureaucracy, that belief once thrived without hierarchy, that truth once traveled quietly, carried by those disciplined enough to hold it. And in an age where power depended on controlling the story, that reminder was intolerable. The Church did not need to prove the Templars wrong. It needed to ensure they were forgotten. But forgetting is never complete. Ideas older than Rome have a way of resurfacing, not as doctrines but as questions. And the Templars, whether intentionally or not, left behind a question that still unsettles history. What if Christianity did not begin as an institution, but as an invitation to understand? At the heart of the unease surrounding the Knights Templar lies a question the medieval Church could never afford to ask openly. It was not whether Jesus existed, nor whether he was worthy of devotion. Those matters were settled long before the Templars rode the roads of Jerusalem. The question was far more destabilizing. Who exactly was Jesus meant to be? For the Church of the 13th century, the answer was clear and non-negotiable. Jesus was fully divine, the incarnate Son of God, the sole bridge between humanity and salvation. This understanding justified the entire structure of ecclesiastical authority. If salvation flowed only through Christ, and Christ was interpreted only through the Church, then the Church stood at the center of human destiny. But history is rarely so simple. Long before doctrine hardened into creeds, early Christians argued intensely about Jesus' nature. Some emphasized his divinity. Others emphasized his humanity. Many held views that did not fit neatly into either category. These disagreements were not marginal. They were foundational. Councils were convened precisely because consensus did not exist. When Rome eventually imposed theological uniformity, it did so by exclusion. Alternative interpretations were labeled heretical and erased. Their texts were destroyed or hidden. Their followers were marginalized or absorbed. The victory of orthodoxy was not merely theological, it was political. The Templars entered this landscape centuries later, but they did not enter a vacuum. In the Holy Land, they encountered Christian traditions that had never fully accepted Rome's conclusions. Eastern churches preserved narratives and emphases unfamiliar to Western clergy. Some spoke of Jesus as a divine messenger rather than an abstract metaphysical entity. Others emphasized his role as a teacher of wisdom, a guide to ethical and spiritual discipline. None of this denied Jesus' importance. It redefined it. If Jesus was understood primarily as a teacher, a man who embodied divine principles rather than monopolized them, then faith became something to be practiced, not merely believed. Salvation became a process of transformation rather than a transaction mediated by clergy. This idea was not new. It echoed traditions the Church had fought for centuries. But in the hands of the Templars, it took on a uniquely disciplined form. Their lives revolved around obedience, restraint, sacrifice, and order. These were not men seeking personal enlightenment or mystical escape. They were men who embodied ideals through action. If they saw Jesus as a model rather than a distant object of worship, it would have aligned seamlessly with their way of life. This interpretation helps explain several otherwise puzzling features of the order. Their lack of emphasis on preaching, their restrained devotional practices, their focus on conduct rather than confession, their silence when accused of doctrinal deviations. They did not reject Christ. They may have understood him differently. During the trials, some confessions, unreliable as they are, hinted at this distinction. A few brothers reportedly stated that Christ was not God in the way people believe. Others suggested he was a prophet or a righteous man elevated by God. These statements, extracted under torture, are difficult to trust. But the ideas behind them did not originate in the torture chamber. They were ancient. If the Templars had encountered texts or teachings portraying Jesus as a teacher of wisdom, similar to figures in Jewish or Hellenistic tradition, they would not have seen this as heresy. They would have seen it as context, as depth. The Church, however, could not tolerate such nuance. The divinity of Christ was not merely a matter of belief. It was the cornerstone of authority. To humanize Jesus too fully was to imply that others might follow his path without institutional mediation. That possibility was existentially threatening. And so, any hint that the Templars embraced a more human Christ was framed as denial rather than reinterpretation. To deny Christ's divinity was heresy. To reinterpret it was indistinguishable from denial in the eyes of authority. The silence of the Templars during this period is telling. They did not attempt to clarify these theological subtleties. They did not argue Christology. They did not cite Scripture. They reaffirmed loyalty and faith in simple terms. This was not intellectual cowardice. It was strategic realism. Theological nuance cannot survive interrogation by power, especially not when outcomes are predetermined. Any attempt to explain a symbolic or philosophical understanding of Christ would have been reduced to denial, mockery, or blasphemy. Better to say nothing than to be misunderstood deliberately. The idea of a human Jesus also sheds light on the Church's anxiety surrounding the order's discipline. If salvation came through imitation rather than absolution, then a life lived according to Christ's example mattered more than ritual compliance. The Templars lived lives of extreme discipline. They shared meals in silence. They obeyed without question. They renounced comfort, family, and personal ambition. They embraced death without fear. These qualities mirrored the moral rigor attributed to Jesus in many early traditions. Such imitation is powerful. It bypasses intermediaries. The Church's role shifted from necessity to commentary. This may explain why accusations against the Templars focused so heavily on denial rather than disbelief. The Church was less concerned that the Templars rejected Christ than that they reframed him in a way that reduced ecclesiastical relevance. To say Jesus was a teacher was not to diminish him. It was to elevate the responsibility of the believer. Responsibility is dangerous in hierarchical systems. It is important to note that this interpretation does not require the Templars to have held a unified theological position. They were not a school of theology. They were a military religious order. Ideas within them would have varied, absorbed informally rather than codified. But shared culture shapes shared understanding. And their culture emphasized practice over proclamation. The Church, by contrast, emphasized doctrine over behavior. This divergence was subtle but profound. After the order's destruction, the idea of a more human Jesus did not disappear. It resurfaced periodically in reform movements, in mystical traditions, in later philosophical interpretations. Each time it provoked controversy. Each time it challenged authority. The Templars became a convenient symbol onto which these anxieties could be projected. They were accused not just of heresy, but of undermining the very nature of Christ. This charge justified extraordinary measures: fire, confiscation, erasure. Yet the persistence of the idea suggests it addressed something real. People have always struggled to reconcile divinity with relatability. A distant God inspires awe. A human teacher inspires imitation. The tension between these images of Jesus has never been fully resolved. The Church chose one path. The Templars may have walked between them. If so, their fate was sealed not because they rejected faith, but because they complicated it. And institutions built on certainty do not survive complication gracefully. The tragedy of the Templars is not that they believed something outrageous. It is that they may have believed something too reasonable, that Jesus' life was meant to be followed, not just worshipped. That belief does not burn easily, and perhaps that is why it had to be buried. Among the many shadows cast over the story of the Knights Templar, few are as controversial or as emotionally charged as the figure of Mary Magdalene. For centuries, her name has carried the weight of distortion, reduced, redefined, and reshaped to fit a narrative that served institutional stability rather than historical complexity. To understand why her presence appears again and again in theories surrounding the Templars, one must first understand why she was erased so thoroughly in the first place. In the earliest Christian sources, Mary Magdalene is not marginal. She is present at the crucifixion when most disciples flee. She is the first witness to the resurrection. In several non-canonical texts, she is portrayed as a favored student of Jesus, one who understands his teachings more deeply than others. These portrayals do not describe a passive follower, but an active participant in the transmission of belief. This alone was destabilizing. As Christianity institutionalized, leadership became male, hierarchical, and increasingly distant from the lived experiences of its earliest communities. A woman who held spiritual authority, especially one associated so closely with Jesus himself, did not fit the emerging structure. Over time, her image was altered. She was recast as a repentant sinner, a warning rather than a leader. Authority was replaced with shame. This transformation was not accidental. By diminishing Mary Magdalene, the Church reinforced a model of spiritual legitimacy that excluded lineage, intimacy, and the feminine. Power was centralized. Transmission of authority was abstracted away from human relationships and anchored instead in office and ordination. But suppressed narratives rarely disappear completely. In the centuries before the Templars, alternative Christian traditions preserved different memories of Mary Magdalene. Some viewed her as the embodiment of wisdom. Others saw her as a symbol of spiritual continuity, a bridge between teaching and practice. These traditions often emphasize balance: masculine and feminine, action and understanding, discipline and compassion. When the Templars arrived in the Holy Land, they entered a region where such ideas had never fully died. Legends circulated quietly, of Jesus' family, of teachings passed through trusted companions, of spiritual authority grounded not in hierarchy, but in relationship. None of this was preached openly. It existed in the margins, in monastic whispers, in symbolic art, in stories told only to those prepared to listen. The Templars, with their discipline and secrecy, were uniquely positioned to encounter these ideas without being overwhelmed by them. One persistent legend suggests that Mary Magdalene carried not just teachings, but a bloodline, that she fled persecution and preserved a lineage that embodied Christ's legacy in human form. Whether taken literally or symbolically, the idea itself was dangerous. A bloodline implies continuity, and continuity threatens institutions built on interruption. If authority could pass through family, relationship, or example, the Church's claim to exclusive mediation weakened. Apostolic succession would no longer be confined to bishops and popes. It would exist in lived memory. There is no concrete evidence that the Templars believed in a literal bloodline, but the symbolic power of the idea is undeniable. It reframes Christianity not as a system imposed from above, but as a living tradition carried forward by people rather than offices. This may explain why Mary Magdalene appears in Templar-associated art and symbolism more often than expected. Not as a sinner, but as a dignified presence. Not foreground, but acknowledged. Her presence suggested a Christianity that valued embodiment over abstraction. The Church's anxiety around such ideas was profound. Feminine spiritual authority undermined rigid hierarchy. Balance undermined absolutism. Relationship undermined bureaucracy. The Templars, as an order that functioned through brotherhood rather than lineage, may have found resonance in the idea of spiritual inheritance that was not tied to office. Their own structure emphasized initiation, discipline, and shared commitment, not birthright. If Mary Magdalene represented continuity through lived example rather than institutional decree, she aligned disturbingly well with their ethos. This alignment did not require conspiracy. It required recognition. The accusations leveled against the Templars during their trials did not explicitly mention Mary Magdalene, but they echoed the Church's long-standing discomfort with alternative forms of authority. The fear was not of women, per se, but of what they symbolized: relational power, intuitive wisdom, and continuity outside sanctioned channels. By the time of the Templar trials, the Church had spent centuries reinforcing a masculine, hierarchical model of faith. Anything that hinted at earlier, more fluid expressions of Christianity was suspect. Mary Magdalene was a reminder of that fluidity. The idea that she had been deliberately marginalized suggested that other truths might also have been suppressed. This implication was far more dangerous than any specific claim about her life. For the Templars, whose identity rested on secrecy and trust, acknowledging such suppression, even implicitly, would have marked them as inheritors of forbidden memory. Memory, after all, is power. The persistence of Mary Magdalene in Templar lore may reflect not belief in sensational legends, but respect for what she represented. The possibility that Christianity's foundations were more human, more relational, and more inclusive than later doctrine allowed. This possibility threatens rigid systems because it invites reinterpretation, and reinterpretation invites autonomy. After the destruction of the order, stories connecting the Templars to Mary Magdalene did not disappear. They migrated. They surfaced in medieval romance, in symbolic art, in whispered genealogies and sacred geographies. Each retelling added embellishment, but the core anxiety remained the same. What if authority did not originate where we were told it did? What if it flowed through people rather than structures? The Church responded to such questions by reinforcing silence, by defining orthodoxy narrowly, by framing alternative memories as dangerous speculation. But silence is never absolute. The Magdalene story endured because it addressed a deep imbalance. It restored the feminine to a narrative that had excluded it. It suggested continuity where rupture had been enforced. It offered a vision of faith grounded in lived relationship rather than distant decree. The Templars, intentionally or not, became associated with this vision because they embodied discipline without spectacle and loyalty without dependence on hierarchy. They did not preach Mary Magdalene's importance. They did not proclaim hidden bloodlines. They simply lived in a way that made such ideas plausible. And that plausibility was enough to provoke fear. The tragedy is not that Mary Magdalene's story was suppressed. It is that its suppression became a template. Once one truth is buried, others follow. The Templars may not have guarded a literal bloodline, but they may have guarded something equally dangerous, the memory that faith once flowed through human connection, not institutional control. That memory, like Mary Magdalene herself, refused to stay buried. And history, unsettled by its persistence, continues to circle the same question. What if the most threatening truths are not those that deny faith, but those that humanize it? Fire has always been more than a weapon. It is a message. In medieval Europe, execution by flame was reserved not simply for criminals, but for ideas deemed too dangerous to survive. When Jacques de Molay was led to the stake on a small island in the Seine in March of 1314, the intention was not merely to kill a man. It was to end a story. Paris gathered to watch. The crowd expected a confession, a final admission of guilt that would seal the narrative crafted over 7 long years. De Molay was old now, his body weakened by imprisonment, his beard gray, his hands scarred by chains. He had once commanded armies and treasuries. Now he stood bound, dressed in simple garments, surrounded by guards who feared neither his strength nor his influence. They feared his words. Up until that moment, the trial of the Knights Templar had followed a predictable script. Confession under pressure, silence under threat, death without disruption. The Church and the Crown expected compliance. What they did not expect was defiance. As the sentence was read, Jacques de Molay spoke. Witnesses later described his voice as steady. Not loud, not frantic, but clear enough to carry across the square. He did not plead. He did not curse the crowd. He did not ask for mercy. He recanted. He declared that the confessions extracted from him were false, born of pain and fear. He proclaimed the innocence of the order. He affirmed his faith in Christ and denied the accusations of heresy outright. In doing so, he shattered the carefully maintained illusion that the trials had uncovered truth. This was catastrophic for the authorities. In medieval law, a heretic who confessed and repented could be spared execution. But one who confessed and then recanted was considered a relapsed heretic beyond redemption. By speaking the truth as he understood it, de Molay sealed his fate. The sentence was carried out immediately. There would be no further inquiry, no appeal to Rome, no delay. Fire was lit at once, as if speed itself could erase the danger of what had been said. As flames rose, de Molay did something unexpected. He prayed, not in panic but in composure. He faced the Cathedral of Notre Dame, not the crowd. According to chroniclers, he called upon God to judge those who had wronged the order and invoked divine justice upon the Pope and the King within the year. To some, This sounded like a curse. To others, it sounded like conviction. The fire did its work quickly. When it was over, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar was gone. His body reduced to ash. His voice silenced. But fire does not destroy meaning. Within weeks, Pope Clement V was dead. Within months, King Philip IV followed him to the grave. Both deaths were sudden. Both were unexpected. Medieval minds, deeply attuned to symbolism, took notice. The curse entered legend. Whether coincidence or consequence, the timing unsettled Europe. Chroniclers recorded it with unease. The destruction of the order no longer felt clean, felt haunted. Yet the significance of de Molay's final act goes far beyond superstition. By recanting publicly, he exposed the fragile foundation upon which the entire case against the Templars rested. His death was not the execution of a proven heretic. It was the elimination of a contradiction. If the Grand Master was innocent, then the trials were a lie. If the trials were a lie, then the confiscations were theft. If the confiscations were theft, then the crown's legitimacy was stained. This chain of implications could not be allowed to stand. Fire was the only response. The emotional power of the execution lay not in its brutality, but in its finality. De Molay represented the last chance for the order to speak with authority. With his death, the Templars became voiceless. Their story would be told by their enemies. Yet something strange happened in the years that followed. The order vanished, but its memory did not fade. Songs, rumors, and whispered accounts circulated. Some portrayed de Molay as a martyr, others as a tragic fool. Few believed he had been a devil worshipper. The official narrative failed to take root. This failure reveals something essential about the execution. It did not resolve doubt. It amplified it. Had de Molay confessed one last time, the story might have ended there. But his refusal forced observers to confront the possibility that the destruction of the Templars had been unjust. Justice, once questioned, is difficult to contain. The execution also exposed the limits of institutional power. The Church could burn bodies, but it could not compel belief. The Crown could seize property, but it could not erase memory. The spectacle intended to demonstrate authority instead revealed its insecurity. Why burn a man who claims innocence if his claims are meaningless? Why rush execution if truth is on your side? These questions lingered. In many ways, de Molay's death marked the transformation of the Templars from a living institution into a symbol. As long as they existed, they could be managed, negotiated with, controlled. Once destroyed, they became something far more dangerous. They became an unanswered question. Legends flourished precisely because certainty was absent. Stories of survival, escape, and secret continuity emerged not because of evidence, but because of doubt. The execution had not convinced the world. It had unsettled it. The image of the old Grand Master standing calmly before the flames proved more powerful than any confession extracted under torture. It contradicted the image of a corrupt heretic. It suggested integrity, conviction, even dignity. Fire, meant to purify, instead preserved. The Church would spend centuries struggling with the legacy of that moment. Papal documents would be sealed. Language would be carefully chosen. The order would be described as suppressed rather than condemned. Ambiguity would become policy. This ambiguity began at the stake. Jacques de Molay did not shout rebellion. He did not incite followers. He did not reveal secrets. He simply told the truth as he saw it and accepted the consequences. That act transformed him, not into a saint, but into a reminder. A reminder that power, when threatened, often chooses destruction over dialogue. That institutions, when cornered, prioritize survival over justice. And that fire, though final in appearance, often ignites the very questions it seeks to extinguish. The Knights Templar ended that day, but the silence they left behind was not empty. It echoed, and in that echo, history continues to hear the words that fire could not erase, words that ask whether the truth was ever truly judged, or merely burned away. When Jacques de Molay's ashes cooled, Europe did not return to normal. Something had shifted. The destruction of the Knights Templar was supposed to close a chapter, to cleanse the spiritual body of Christendom and restore order. Instead, it left behind a residue of unease that settled slowly, almost imperceptibly, over courts and cloisters alike. The first tremor came with the deaths. Pope Clement V died less than a month after de Molay's execution. King Philip IV followed him within the year. Neither man had been young, but neither death was expected so soon. To modern eyes, the coincidence may seem unremarkable. To medieval observers, steeped in symbolism and divine causality, it was impossible to ignore. Chronicles recorded the timing with care. Whispers spread quickly. Had God intervened? Had injustice provoked judgment? Or had de Molay's final words carried a power beyond human understanding? The idea of a curse took root not because it was sensational, but because it provided meaning in a moment that felt morally unbalanced. The curse was never official doctrine. The Church did not endorse it. The Crown dismissed it. But stories do not require permission to spread. They require resonance. And this one resonated deeply. For centuries, rulers had justified their authority by claiming divine favor. Victory signaled righteousness. Longevity suggested blessing. Sudden death, especially following a controversial act, raised questions that no proclamation could silence. The collapse of Philip's direct lineage compounded the unease. His sons ruled briefly and died young. Within a generation, the Capetian dynasty ended, plunging France into instability that would culminate in war, famine, and plague. To contemporaries, this sequence felt less like chance and more like consequence. The narrative wrote itself. Whether or not a literal curse existed was irrelevant. What mattered was that people believed something had gone wrong, that a moral boundary had been crossed and the balance disturbed. This belief shaped memory. The Templars, once feared as heretics, began to be remembered differently. Not as saints, but as victims. Men who had been wronged. The public imagination shifted subtly, but decisively. Sympathy replaced suspicion. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, through stories told quietly, through doubts expressed cautiously. The official narrative remained intact, but it no longer felt complete. Doubt has a way of widening cracks. The Church, sensitive to this shift, responded with silence rather than clarification. It did not revisit the trials. It did not issue new explanations. It allowed ambiguity to settle, hoping time would dull its edge. Time, however, often sharpens what it cannot erase. The deaths of Clement and Philip became symbolic bookends to the Templars' destruction. Whether coincidence or not, they framed the event as something unfinished. As if judgment had been passed too quickly, and consequences followed accordingly. This sense of unfinished business fueled speculation. People began to question not only the guilt of the Templars, but the nature of justice itself. If powerful men could manipulate faith for political ends, what did that mean for salvation? If the Church could suppress truth to maintain unity, where did conscience reside? These were dangerous questions in a medieval world. They did not lead to immediate rebellion, but they planted seeds. Seeds of skepticism, seeds of reform. The curse narrative also served another function. It humanized the Templars' story. It framed their destruction not as a bureaucratic decision, but as a moral drama with cosmic stakes. In doing so, it preserved emotional engagement long after factual details faded. This emotional memory proved resilient. Centuries later, historians would debate the trials in academic terms. But long before that, ordinary people remembered the story as a warning. Power taken unjustly invites ruin. The Church's discomfort with this narrative is evident in how carefully it managed the Templars' legacy. The order was not rehabilitated, but it was not fully condemned either. Its name lingered in a liminal space, neither honored nor entirely disgraced. This liminality allowed legend to flourish. Some claimed the Templars' wealth had vanished mysteriously, spirited away before the arrests. Others insisted surviving members regrouped elsewhere. These stories gained traction precisely because the official account lacked closure. If justice had been served, why did the aftermath feel so unstable? The curse, in this sense, was less about supernatural punishment and more about moral accounting. It expressed a collective intuition that wrong had been done and not adequately addressed. Moral debts, like financial ones, accrue interest. The deaths of Philip and Clement did not restore the Templars. They did not undo the trials. But they shifted the balance of perception. They suggested that authority, when abused, carries consequences beyond immediate gain. This idea lingered quietly through the centuries. It resurfaced during periods of crisis, when institutions were questioned and power seemed brittle. The Templars became a symbol not of heresy, but of suppressed truth. Their fate was invoked whenever faith collided with politics. The curse story also underscores an important psychological truth. Humans seek patterns, especially in moments of moral discomfort. Coincidence feels insufficient when injustice goes unresolved. We look for meaning that restores equilibrium. Whether or not divine judgment played a role, the narrative of the curse served to reassert a sense of moral order that the trials had disrupted. It said, power is not absolute. Authority is not immune. Actions have consequences, even if delayed. This message was deeply comforting. For the church and crown, however, it was unsettling. It suggested that legitimacy rested not just on force or decree, but on perceived justice. Once that perception eroded, control became fragile. The Templars, ironically, gained influence in death. Their destruction exposed the vulnerability of the systems that destroyed them. It revealed that unity maintained through suppression is brittle, and that silence breeds suspicion rather than closure. The curse narrative endured because it filled a vacuum left by unanswered questions. It offered a story where official explanations failed. It transformed coincidence into commentary. Even today, the deaths of Clement and Philip are cited not as proof of supernatural vengeance, but as symbols of a deeper truth, that injustice leaves echoes. The Knights Templar did not rise from the ashes. They did not reclaim their name. But their story did something perhaps more powerful. It refused to end cleanly. The silence following their fall was not peace. It was a pause, one filled with unresolved tension that history continues to feel. And in that pause, the idea of a curse persists, not as superstition, but as a reminder that power exercised without conscience never truly escapes judgment. Whether by God, by history, or by the slow erosion of legitimacy itself. Officially, the Knights Templar ended in fire, confiscation, and silence. Their properties were seized, their leadership destroyed, their name erased from rolls and records. According to the formal story, the order ceased to exist. And yet, history has a habit of misplacing absolutes. Institutions vanish cleanly on parchment, but people rarely do. Almost immediately after the arrests of 1307, irregularities appeared. Not every Templar was captured. Not every commandery was raided. Not every brother was accounted for. In some regions, arrests were delayed. In others, they were resisted quietly or carried out with deliberate reluctance. Records from England, Scotland, Portugal, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire tell a more fragmented story than the synchronized destruction scene in France. This fragmentation created space. In the chaos following the arrests, communication broke down. Orders contradicted one another. Local rulers interpreted papal instructions selectively. Some prioritized loyalty to Rome. Others prioritized stability. A few prioritized conscience. Within this confusion, Templars slipped through. Some disappeared into monastic life, absorbed quietly into other orders under new names. Others returned to families they had left decades earlier, identities blurred by time and distance. A small number, likely those with skills rather than rank, found places within secular administration or mercantile networks. Survival did not require conspiracy. It required adaptability. Portugal offers the clearest example. King Denis I, skeptical of the charges and unwilling to destroy a valuable institution, negotiated with the papacy. Rather than disband the Templars entirely, he reorganized them under a new name, the Order of Christ. Their properties were transferred intact. Their members retained status. Their mission continued, altered but recognizable. This was not defiance. It was preservation. Under this new banner, former Templars played a crucial role in Portugal's rise as a maritime power. They financed voyages, built infrastructure, and supported exploration that would eventually reshape the world. The Red Cross of the Templars reappeared on Portuguese sails, not as rebellion, but as continuity. In Scotland, the story is murkier, but no less intriguing. At the time of the arrests, Scotland was under excommunication, engaged in open conflict with England. Papal authority there was weak. Enforcement of orders from Rome was inconsistent at best. Some traditions claim that Templars found refuge among Scottish clans, particularly those hostile to English influence. There is no definitive proof, but there is an absence of contradiction. No records show large-scale arrests of Templars in Scotland. No executions are documented. Given the political climate, it is plausible that local leaders saw no benefit in enforcing a distant king's purge. Legends place Templars at the Battle of Bannockburn, fighting alongside Robert the Bruce. Whether symbolic or factual, the persistence of this claim speaks to a deeper belief that the order did not simply vanish but changed form. Elsewhere, quieter paths of survival unfolded. In the German lands, some Templars were acquitted or lightly punished. In Italy, enforcement varied wildly by region. In Spain, the process dragged on for years, during which many brothers were released or reassigned. The image of a uniformly destroyed order dissolves under scrutiny. This does not mean the Templars survived as a centralized institution. They did not. The structures that defined them, hierarchy, command, identity, were dismantled. But structures are not the same as ideas or skills. Those endured. Former Templars carried with them a distinctive culture. Discipline without ostentation, loyalty without spectacle, efficiency without display. These traits found homes wherever order and organization were valued. Over time, this quiet dispersal fed the myth of survival. People began to notice patterns. Familiar symbols resurfaced in unexpected places. Practices resembling Templar administration appeared in new contexts. Networks of trust echoed older systems. Coincidence? Perhaps. But memory has its own logic. The idea that the Templars survived appealed because it made sense of unresolved tension. If an order was destroyed unjustly, it felt right that something of it endured. Survival became a form of moral balance. Yet survival did not require secrecy in the sensational sense. No hidden councils, no grand masters in exile, no unified underground movement. Survival was mundane. It looked like adaptation, like compromise, like silence. Those who had lived under vows of secrecy were well suited to disappearing into plain sight. They did not announce themselves. They did not demand recognition. They understood the value of anonymity. Their training emphasized function over identity. This made them difficult to trace. The myths that grew around Templar survival, hidden fleets, secret treasures, shadow governments, say more about human longing than historical reality. People want stories with clear lines of continuity, dramatic resistance, and hidden guardians. The truth, if less romantic, is more unsettling. The Templars did not survive by defying power. They survived by becoming irrelevant to it. They blended. In doing so, they ensured that whatever they had learned, whatever methods they had refined, would persist beyond the life of the order. This raises an important point. If the Templars had truly possessed a single explosive secret, a relic, a document, a revelation, survival would have been more difficult. Such an object would attract attention. It would demand protection. It would leave traces. But if what they carried was knowledge, administrative, logistical, philosophical, it could be distributed, diluted, integrated, made invisible. Knowledge survives best when it is no longer recognized as foreign. This may explain why later generations struggled to locate a definitive point of continuity. The Templars did not pass on a manifesto. They passed on ways of thinking, of organizing, of trusting. These are harder to detect. The Church, in suppressing the order, succeeded in destroying its public identity. It did not, and perhaps could not erase the habits formed over 2 centuries of operation. The irony is sharp. By dissolving the order rather than condemning it fully, the Church created ambiguity. Ambiguity allowed fragments to slip through unnoticed. Clear condemnation might have prompted clearer enforcement. Suppression invited inconsistency. In that inconsistency, survival found room. The enduring fascination with escaped Templars is not driven by evidence alone. It is driven by discomfort with the idea that institutions can be erased unjustly and leave nothing behind. We want continuity because it reassures us that injustice is never final. Whether or not individual Templars consciously preserved a legacy, their disappearance seeded something powerful: doubt. Doubt about official narratives. Doubt about clean endings. Doubt about the ability of authority to control outcomes completely. The Templars, trained to operate across borders and cultures, understood impermanence. They had seen cities fall, kingdoms collapse, faiths shift. They knew that survival did not always mean victory. Sometimes it meant waiting. Their disappearance was not a retreat into shadows so much as a return to anonymity, the very state from which they had emerged 2 centuries earlier. And perhaps that is the most fitting end. An order born in obscurity returned to it, leaving behind not a secret society, but a question. If so much could vanish so completely, yet still leave traces, what else in history might have survived not as a thing, but as a pattern? The Knights Templar did not escape as knights. They escaped as people. And people, once freed from names and banners, are far harder to erase. When institutions fall, their symbols often outlive them. Stripped of official meaning, those symbols drift, reused, reinterpreted, and quietly repurposed by later generations who sense power in their forms even if they no longer remember their origins. This is precisely what happened after the disappearance of the Knights Templar. Long after the order itself was erased, its visual language refused to die. The Red Cross is the most obvious example. Once stitched onto white mantles and carried into battle, it marked men who belonged to no nation and answered to no crown. After the Templars' fall, the symbol did not vanish. It reappeared, altered slightly, placed in new contexts, stripped of explicit Templar identity but retaining its aura of authority and sacrifice. Symbols rarely survive by accident. Across Europe, architectural motifs associated with Templar commanderies began to surface in unexpected places. Rounded churches, geometric floor patterns, stark, functional design emphasizing symmetry and proportion rather than ornament. These features were not unique to the Templars, but their persistence after the order's suppression raised quiet questions. Why did builders continue to replicate a style associated with a disgraced order? The answer may lie not in allegiance, but in practicality. The Templars built with purpose. Their designs prioritized durability, efficiency, and symbolic clarity. Later architects adopted these principles because they worked, not because they wished to honor the order explicitly. In this way, Templar influence became invisible. The same pattern appears in organizational structure. The order's internal hierarchy was rigid but merit-based. Advancement depended on discipline and reliability rather than birth. Decision-making followed clear chains of command. Resources were pooled and redistributed with remarkable efficiency. After the Templars' fall, similar structures emerged elsewhere. Guilds, merchant associations, later chivalric orders. Even early bureaucratic states adopted systems that echoed Templar practice. Centralized accounting, standardized rules, codes of conduct enforced internally rather than imposed externally. None of these institutions called themselves Templar. They did not need to. The methods had already proven effective. Perhaps the most controversial legacy lies in symbolism later associated with secrecy and fraternity. Centuries after the Templars' destruction, organizations emphasizing brotherhood, initiation, and symbolic knowledge emerged across Europe. They used ritual not to hide wrongdoing, but to create cohesion and shared identity. Modern observers are often tempted to draw direct lines between these groups and the Templars. In most cases, such connections are speculative at best. But direct descent is not required for influence to exist. Ideas migrate, The Templars demonstrated that loyalty could be cultivated through shared discipline rather than shared blood. That secrecy could be functional rather than conspiratorial. That symbols could encode values rather than commands. These lessons were absorbed by later generations living in very different contexts. The persistence of Templar-associated imagery in art is especially revealing. Medieval and Renaissance artists occasionally depicted crosses, temples, and architectural forms with ambiguous references. Not overt tributes, but subtle allusions that scholars still debate. Were these conscious nods to a fallen order, or simply the recycling of powerful imagery divorced from its original meaning? Perhaps both. Symbols endure because they resonate. They carry emotional weight. The Templar symbols were forged in sacrifice, discipline, and mystery. That combination is difficult to replicate and difficult to forget. Even the myths that grew around the order contributed to this endurance. Stories of hidden treasure, secret knowledge, and survival in disguise kept the Templars alive in popular imagination long after historical records fell silent. These myths, though exaggerated, performed a cultural function. They preserved memory when documentation failed. Over time, the line between history and symbolism blurred. The Templars became less an institution and more an archetype, the disciplined guardian, the silent protector, the order that knew too much and paid the price. Archetypes do not require accuracy to persist. They require relevance. As Europe moved into the early modern period, power structures shifted. Kings consolidated authority. Churches fractured. New philosophies challenged old certainties. In this environment, the image of the Templars as victims of power resonated deeply. They symbolized the danger of independence. They symbolized the cost of secrecy. They symbolized the tension between conscience and authority. These symbolic roles were more enduring than any single doctrine or artifact. Even today, references to the Templars surface in contexts far removed from medieval history. In literature, in film, in political rhetoric, in speculative thought, often stripped of nuance, but still potent. Why? Because the story they represent remains unresolved. The Order's end was not clean. It was not definitive. It left behind unanswered questions, sealed documents, and moral ambiguity. Symbols thrive in such conditions. They offer a way to engage with complexity without resolving it. The Red Cross no longer signifies a specific order. It signifies an idea: disciplined resistance, loyalty beyond convenience, sacrifice misunderstood. The irony is that the Church's attempt to erase the Templars amplified their symbolic power. By destroying the institution, it freed the symbols from official control. Once detached from authority, symbols become malleable, capable of being adopted by anyone who finds meaning in them. Had the Templars been quietly reformed or absorbed, their imagery might have faded into obscurity. Suppression transformed them into icons. This phenomenon is not unique to the Templars. History repeatedly shows that persecution strengthens symbolism. Fire burns bodies, not meaning. The silent survival of Templar symbols suggests that what truly threatened authority was not any single secret, but the example they set. An organization built on discipline, transnational loyalty, and internal accountability posed a model that later generations could admire even without understanding its origins. That admiration did not require allegiance. It required recognition. The Templars' symbols endured because they answered a recurring human need: the desire for order without tyranny, for belonging without submission to arbitrary power, for meaning grounded in action rather than proclamation. These needs did not vanish with the Middle Ages. They persist, and so do the symbols that once embodied them. The question is not whether the Knights Templar secretly survived as an organization. History offers little support for that. The question is whether the ideas they embodied proved too useful to disappear. Judging by the persistence of their symbols, quietly resurfacing, stripped of names and banners, the answer may be uncomfortable. The order died, but its language did not. And languages, once spoken into the world, have a way of being learned by those who need them most, long after the original speakers are gone. For centuries, one belief lingered beneath every discussion of the Knights Templar: that the full truth of their fate was not lost, only hidden. While fires consumed men and confiscations scattered records across Europe, another repository remained untouched by chaos: the vast, silent archives of the Vatican. Behind stone walls and locked doors, shelves of parchment accumulated not by accident, but by design. What was preserved there was not history as it happened, but history as it was allowed to survive. The Vatican archives were never meant to be a public memory. They were an institutional memory, selective, deliberate, and guarded. Documents entered those vaults not because they were interesting, but because they were sensitive. Political correspondence, private confessions, papal inquiries never intended for public eyes. If the Templars' destruction involved compromise, hesitation, or doubt at the highest levels, this is where the evidence would rest. For generations, access was nearly impossible. Scholars relied on fragments, copies of trial records, royal decrees, second-hand chronicles. These sources told a consistent story of accusation and punishment, but they left glaring gaps. Why did the Pope hesitate? Why was the order suppressed rather than condemned? Why did papal language remain so carefully ambiguous? The answers were not absent. They were locked away. The Vatican's control over its archives was absolute until the modern era. Requests were denied. Catalogs were incomplete. Entire collections remained classified. This secrecy fueled speculation, not without reason. When institutions refuse transparency for centuries, suspicion becomes inevitable. Then slowly something changed. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, limited access was granted to select scholars. What they found did not confirm the dramatic legends of hidden gospels or explosive revelations. Instead, they uncovered something quieter and far more unsettling: doubt. Letters between church officials revealed uncertainty about the charges against the Templars. Reports from papal investigators contradicted royal narratives. Testimonies taken without torture painted a different picture from those extracted under pain. Again and again, the same theme emerged. The evidence for heresy was thin, inconsistent, and politically charged. The most striking discovery came with the unearthing of the Chinon parchment, a document long misfiled and forgotten. It recorded the secret absolution of the Templar leadership by Pope Clement V. The highest figures of the order had been reconciled to the Church. Their sins, whatever they were forgiven. This document should have changed everything. It did not. The Chinon parchment was never publicized at the time. It remained sealed, its implications buried under centuries of silence. When it finally came to light, modern scholars were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Church knew the Templars were not heretics, and still allowed them to be destroyed. This revelation reframed the Vatican archives not as guardians of explosive secrets, but as custodians of moral compromise. The vaults did not hide forbidden knowledge about Christ or lost bloodlines. They hid hesitation. They hid fear. They hid the quiet recognition that justice had been sacrificed for stability. This kind of secrecy is harder to confront than sensational myth. It suggests that the destruction of the Templars was not driven by certainty, but by calculation. That leaders who doubted the accusations chose silence rather than resistance. That the Church valued unity over truth. The archives contain no single document labeled "The Secret of the Templars." Instead, they contain something more damning: a pattern of avoidance. Papal correspondence reveals repeated efforts to soften language, delay decisions, and avoid definitive judgments. Legal documents are carefully phrased to suppress rather than condemn. Even the transfer of Templar assets is framed as administrative necessity rather than punishment. This bureaucratic tone masks violence. The Vatican archives show how institutions sanitize destruction, how moral ambiguity is transformed into procedural inevitability, how the absence of condemnation can coexist with lethal outcomes. One of the most telling aspects of the archival material is what it lacks. There is no definitive statement declaring the Templars guilty of doctrinal heresy, no clear theological refutation, no conclusive proof presented to the faithful. The order simply disappears from official language, replaced by euphemism and silence. Erasure without explanation. This approach reflects a deeper truth about power. Institutions often prefer ambiguity to accountability. A clear declaration invites debate. Silence allows memory to fade. But memory did not fade. The partial opening of the Vatican archives did not end speculation. It refined it. Scholars now argue less about what the Templars believed and more about why the Church chose not to clarify. This shift is significant. It suggests that the real secret was never theological. It was institutional. The Church faced a choice: confront a powerful king and risk fracture, or sacrifice an order and preserve stability. The archives reveal which choice was made and how carefully it was concealed. The vaults also preserve another uncomfortable reality: the limits of moral courage. Clement V was not a villain. He was a man navigating immense pressure. The documents show a pope aware of injustice, yet unwilling to act decisively against it. This human weakness is harder to mythologize than demon worship. It forces us to confront a less dramatic but more pervasive truth. History is often shaped not by evil intent, but by fear, hesitation, and compromise. The Vatican archives do not reveal a church hiding a cosmic revelation. They reveal a church hiding itself, its doubts, its failures, its unfinished judgments. This is perhaps why access remained restricted for so long. Not because the truth was too explosive, but because it was too ordinary. Ordinary people in extraordinary positions making flawed decisions. That kind of truth destabilizes authority far more effectively than any heretical gospel. Even today, large portions of the archives remain closed. Not necessarily because they contain shocking revelations, but because they contain context. Context that complicates narratives of righteousness and certainty. And institutions built on moral authority struggle with complication. The allure of the Vatican vaults persists because they represent the possibility of reckoning. The idea that somewhere, written in careful Latin, lies acknowledgement of doubt. A silent admission that the destruction of the Templars was not wholly just. Whether or not further documents ever emerge, the pattern is clear. The Church did not bury the Templars' secret. It buried its own uncertainty, and that uncertainty has echoed for 7 centuries. The true power of the archives lies not in what they conceal, but in what they reveal unintentionally. That even the most powerful institutions are vulnerable to fear, and that silence, when chosen over truth, becomes a legacy of its own. The Knights Templar vanished from history, but the questions their destruction raised were carefully filed away rather than answered. And as long as those questions remain, the vaults will continue to cast a long shadow, not over the Templars, but over those who chose silence when clarity was needed most. When all the layers of accusation, fear, politics, and myth are stripped away, what remains is not a relic, a bloodline, or a forbidden book. What remains is an idea, quiet, unsettling, and profoundly destabilizing. If the Knights Templar had a final secret, it was not something they possessed, but something they understood. The secret was not that the Church was false, nor that Christ was a fabrication. It was something far more uncomfortable, that faith, power, and truth do not naturally belong to the same structure. For centuries, the medieval Church fused belief with authority. Salvation flowed through institutions. Meaning was administered. Truth was defined, guarded, and enforced. This system brought order to chaos, but it demanded obedience in return. To question it was to risk spiritual exile. The Templars lived inside this system and slowly discovered its limits. Their lives exposed them to contradiction. They fought in the name of God and watched faithful men die screaming beneath the same sun. They guarded pilgrims who prayed with sincerity, yet were slaughtered without mercy. They negotiated truces with enemies whose devotion was as absolute as their own. Over time, experience eroded certainty. Experience does that. What the Templars learned was not heresy. It was perspective. They learned that faith survives outside institutions. That devotion does not require hierarchy. That discipline can exist without domination. That moral authority does not always align with political power, even when both claim divine justification. This understanding did not need to be written down. It reshaped behavior. The order became less theatrical, more restrained, less interested in preaching, more focused on conduct, less reliant on spectacle, more invested in structure. Their silence was not emptiness. It was caution. Perspective, once gained, cannot be unlearned. The Church sensed this shift even if it could not name it. The Templars were no longer just soldiers or bankers. They were men who had seen too much, who understood too many contradictions, who no longer needed certainty imposed from above. That independence of thought was the true threat. An institution can tolerate corruption. It can reform excess, can even absorb dissent. What it cannot easily survive is irrelevance. If faith could be lived without mediation, the Church's role changed fundamentally. If authority could be earned through discipline rather than inherited through office, hierarchy weakened. If truth could be approached through experience rather than decree, control dissolved. The Templars embodied all three possibilities. They did not announce this worldview. They did not campaign for reform. They did not challenge doctrine publicly. They simply lived in a way that made alternatives visible. And visibility was enough. When pressure mounted, the Church and Crown did not attempt to debate the Templars' ideas. They did not issue theological rebuttals. They did not clarify doctrine. They destroyed the order instead. This is telling. You do not burn men to refute arguments. You burn men to erase examples. The final secret, then, was not hidden in Jerusalem or locked in a vault. It was encoded in the order's existence. The Templars demonstrated that a transnational, disciplined, purpose-driven community could operate outside traditional power structures and thrive. They showed that loyalty could be cultivated without fear, that wealth could be managed without greed, that belief could coexist with inquiry. This was not rebellion. It was evolution. And evolution terrifies institutions built on permanence. The irony is that by destroying the Templars, the Church confirmed the very insight it feared. Power, when threatened, chooses survival over truth. Authority, when cornered, prioritizes control over justice. The trials exposed this reality brutally. Confessions extracted under pain. Evidence ignored when inconvenient. Doubt buried to preserve unity. Silence enforced to maintain legitimacy. None of this aligned with the moral certainty the Church claimed to embody. The Templars did not reveal this hypocrisy. The Church revealed it itself. The final secret, then, is not about what the Templars believed, but what their destruction revealed. That institutions claiming absolute truth are often most afraid of ambiguity, not because ambiguity is false, but because it cannot be controlled. This secret does not indict faith. It indicts monopoly. Faith can endure questioning. Institutions often cannot. The legacy of the Templars is not a hidden lineage or an occult doctrine. It is a mirror held up to power, reflecting its fragility. Their story endures because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that moral authority does not automatically accompany institutional authority, even when wrapped in sacred language. This realization is unsettling because it does not belong to the past. It applies wherever belief and power intertwine. The Templars were destroyed not because they denied God, but because they made God unnecessary as a tool of control. They proved that discipline, meaning, and purpose could exist without constant supervision from above. That was the secret worth burying. And yet, it could not be fully buried because it was never confined to an object or a doctrine. It lived in behavior, in structure, in example. Those things are contagious. Every time history witnesses an institution silencing dissent rather than addressing it, the Templars' story resurfaces. Every time authority demands obedience without accountability, their fate feels familiar. The final secret is not hidden. It is repeating, and that may be the most dangerous truth of all. Institutions do not destroy what they fully understand. They destroy what they cannot control. This is the uncomfortable lens through which the fate of the Knights Templar must ultimately be viewed. By the time the order was erased, the issue was no longer guilt or innocence, orthodoxy or heresy. The issue was survival not of faith but of authority. The medieval church did not fear the Templars because they were corrupt. Corruption could be punished, corrected, absorbed. It feared them because they represented a form of belief and organization that functioned without constant institutional supervision. That distinction mattered more than doctrine. For centuries, the Church had positioned itself as the sole interpreter of divine truth. Salvation passed through its sacraments. Meaning flowed through its hierarchy. To belong to God was, in practice, to belong to the Church. This fusion of faith and administration created stability, but it also created dependency. The Templars disrupted that dependency without ever declaring rebellion. They answered to Rome, yes, but not to local bishops. They operated across borders, beyond national loyalties. They held wealth without personal ownership. They enforced discipline without spectacle. They required obedience without fear. Most importantly, they did not rely on preaching to justify themselves. They simply functioned. This functionality was dangerous because it exposed a truth the Church could not afford to highlight: that spiritual purpose could be sustained through structure and discipline rather than constant doctrinal reinforcement. If men could live lives of devotion without clerical mediation, the Church's central claim weakened. The Church's response was not theological engagement, but narrative control. When questions arise that cannot be answered without conceding power, institutions change the subject. They reframe, they accuse, they simplify. The story of the Templars was simplified deliberately. A complex order became a caricature of heresy. Secrecy became deviance. Discipline became deception. Silence became guilt. Once framed this way, destruction could be justified not as suppression, but as purification. This reframing served a crucial function. It allowed the Church to eliminate a destabilizing presence without acknowledging why it was destabilizing. The language of heresy concealed the language of fear. Fear of losing interpretive monopoly. Fear of being unnecessary. Fear that faith might outgrow its container. The Church did not need the Templars to be wrong. It needed them to be gone. This distinction explains the strange contradictions surrounding the trials. Why evidence was inconsistent. Why confessions were contradictory. Why papal language remained ambiguous. Why absolution could coexist with execution. The goal was never clarity. The goal was resolution. Resolution does not require truth. It requires finality. By suppressing the order rather than condemning it outright, the Church preserved flexibility. It avoided theological confrontation while achieving practical elimination. It buried the problem without defining it. This strategy worked institutionally, but it left a residue. The residue is doubt. Doubt about whether the Church acted out of righteousness or necessity. Doubt about whether authority aligned with justice. Doubt about whether unity was preserved at the cost of truth. These doubts did not erupt immediately. They simmered. They waited. They resurfaced in later centuries whenever institutional authority came under scrutiny. The Reformation did not emerge from the Templars' story, but it echoed it. Questions about mediation, authority, and access to truth reappeared with explosive force. The same fault lines cracked open again. This pattern reveals something fundamental about institutional behavior. When confronted with challenges that threaten relevance rather than correctness, institutions choose control over conversation. The Church buried the Templars not because it could disprove them, but because it could not integrate them without changing itself. Change is more frightening than destruction. The Templars embodied a model of faith that was disciplined, communal, and experiential. It was not anarchic. It did not reject structure. But it did not require constant reinforcement from a central authority. That autonomy was intolerable. The Church's survival depended on being indispensable. The Templars suggested it might not be. The irony is profound. By destroying the order, the Church preserved its immediate authority, but weakened its moral credibility. Silence replaced explanation. Force replaced persuasion. Fear replaced confidence. These choices ensured survival but not trust. Trust, once eroded, is difficult to restore. Centuries later, when documents emerged revealing papal doubt and secret absolution, the Church's long silence became part of the indictment. Not because the Church was uniquely corrupt, but because it behaved like any institution prioritizing stability over transparency. The Templars were buried to protect the system, but systems that bury truth inherit its shadow. The Church's decision did not erase the ideas the Templars embodied.